The night I learned that buildings can listen was the night I parked my old Volkswagen camper at the edge of a hollow where the mountains pressed so close together they seemed to whisper to each other. My name is Caleb Mercer. I was 37 that fall, alone by choice, carrying more miles behind me than ahead, driving that faded orange VW because it forced me to slow down. Slowing down was the point. I'd spent years outrunning a restlessness I couldn't name. Divorces, deadlines, city noise, and the back roads of eastern Kentucky felt like the last place that restlessness might finally get tired and sit down. Harlan County wasn't on my itinerary. It never is. You don't plan to end up there. You drift into it, pulled by roads that narrow without warning and darkness that falls earlier than you expect. By the time I realized how remote I was, the sky had already turned the color of old bruises, and my phone showed one thin bar of service that blinked like it was thinking about giving up. I'd planned to sleep in the VW that night. I always did. But the air changed as I climbed higher, thicker, damp, with a cold edge that slipped under my jacket and settled between my shoulder blades. The smell of wet leaves and coal dust seeped in through the cracked window. My headlights carved a weak tunnel through fog that clung low to the road, and every few minutes I caught sight of something pale between the trees. Old trailers, rusted appliances, shapes that looked like people until they weren't. Denial came easy to me back then. I told myself the unease was just fatigue, that the tightness in my chest was nothing more than altitude and cold. I had ignored instincts before and survived. I was good at that. Then the engine coughed, once, twice. The dashboard lights flickered, and the VW lost power like it had exhaled its last breath. I coasted to a stop on a gravel turnout just wide enough for a single vehicle, surrounded by trees that rose straight and black, blotting out the sky. When I turned the key again, all I got was a hollow click, echoing too loud in the quiet. I sat there with my hands on the wheel, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, to the forest settling in around me. No wind, no insects, just the slow drip of water somewhere in the dark and the distant, hollow sound of something moving far down slope. That was when I saw the church. It stood across the road, half hidden by laurel and shadow, a simple white clapboard building leaning slightly downhill as if it were tired of standing. No lights, no cars, just a narrow gravel path leading up to double wooden doors beneath a crooked steeple. The paint was peeling in long strips, exposing gray wood beneath, and the windows were dark, their glass clouded with age. A church meant shelter, dry floor, maybe warmth if there was still a stove inside. I told myself that's all it was. Practical thinking. Nothing spiritual about it. Still, I waited a full minute before opening the VW door, listening, sniffing the air like an animal deciding whether to bolt or freeze. When I stepped out, the cold hit harder than I expected. It carried a metallic smell, sharp and old, and underneath it something faintly sweet like rotting flowers. Gravel crunched too loud under my boots as I crossed the road. The church seemed to loom larger with every step, its shadow swallowing the ground around me. Up close, I saw a hand-painted sign nailed crookedly beside the door. The letters were faded but legible. Welcome all, no times, no denomination, no warmth in the message. Just an instruction. The door resisted when I pushed it, then gave way with a groan that sounded disturbingly like a sigh. Inside, the air was warmer, stale, carrying the scent of dust, mildew, and something else I couldn't place at first. Wax, maybe, burned long ago. I closed the door behind me, more to keep the cold out than anything else, and the sound echoed through the empty space, bouncing off wooden pews and bare walls. The church was small, maybe 40 seats, an altar at the front with a faded cloth draped over it. A wooden cross hung slightly askew on the wall, its shadow stretching long in the beam of my flashlight. There was no electricity, no candles, just silence so thick it pressed against my ears. I told myself I'd sleep near the door. Quick rest. First light, I'd hike back to the road, flag someone down. Rational plans have a way of making fear feel manageable. As I laid out my sleeping bag on the floor beside the last pew, I noticed the stairs. They were narrow, tucked behind a door near the altar, leading down into darkness. A basement, I assumed. Churches always had them. Storage. Fellowship halls. I swept my flashlight beam down the steps, but the light seemed to stop halfway, swallowed by black. I shut the door quickly, irritated at myself for even looking. Midnight crept up without ceremony. No bells, no change in the air, just my watch ticking softly as I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the plaster that looked like branching veins. That was when I heard the first sound, a low hum. So faint at first I thought it was tinnitus, the ringing you get when things are too quiet. But it wasn't steady. It wavered, rising and falling, carrying a shape that my mind struggled to fit into something familiar. It was singing, not words I recognized, just a melody, slow and mournful, drifting up from beneath the floorboards. I sat up, heart thudding, every nerve awake. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the stairs, from below. I told myself there had to be another entrance, a cellar door outside. Someone sheltering, same as me. Old churches echoed, sound traveled in strange ways. Denial again, rising automatically, like muscle memory. Then the doors slammed. The sound was explosive, a sudden, violent crack that shook dust from the rafters and sent a shock through my chest. I spun toward the entrance just in time to see the double doors shudder, their handles rattling as if struck from the outside. I was on my feet in an instant, flashlight beam shaking as I crossed the aisle. I grabbed the handle and pulled. It didn't move. I pulled harder, panic flooding in, cold and sharp. The doors felt solid now, fused to the frame. I threw my shoulder into them once, twice, the impact reverberating through my bones, but they didn't budge. Behind me, the singing grew louder. It was closer now, individual voices separating from the hum, men and women, old and young, layered together in a harmony that made my skin prickle. The floor vibrated faintly beneath my boots, a subtle tremor like distant thunder. I turned slowly, flashlight beam swinging back toward the altar, toward the door that led to the stairs. The singing was coming from below. I backed away from the door, breath coming fast, thoughts racing, trying to assemble logic out of terror. Old recordings, wind through pipes, acoustics, anything but what my instincts were screaming. The door to the basement creaked. It opened just enough for darkness to spill out, thick and lightless, swallowing the beam of my flashlight as if it were nothing. And from that darkness, the singing rose, full and clear now, filling the church with a sound that felt older than the building itself. I stood there, trapped between doors that would not open and a stairway that should not lead anywhere at all, knowing with a sudden, sick certainty that whatever was below me did not need stairs to come up. The singing didn't rush me. That was the worst part. It didn't surge or explode or announce itself like a threat that wanted to be seen. It stayed slow, deliberate, patient, like it knew I had nowhere else to go and all the time in the world to understand that. I took a step back, then another, until my calves bumped the edge of a pew. The wood was cold through my jeans. The flashlight trembled in my hand, its beam jittering across the altar, the crooked cross, the open basement door breathing darkness. The smell changed then. The stale dust was still there, but layered over it was something damp and mineral, like freshly turned soil mixed with old water. The smell of ground that had never seen sunlight. My instinct screamed at me to run, but run where? The doors were locked in a way that felt final, not mechanical. No click of a bolt, no give in the hinges, just refusal. I swallowed hard and forced myself to think. Think like a man, not a scared animal. If someone was down there, if this was some elaborate cruelty or local prank, then sound meant people. People meant rules. I could talk. I could reason. Hello? My voice came out thin, swallowed by the space before it reached the altar. The singing didn't stop. If anything, it tightened, the harmony pulling closer together as if my voice had tuned them. I took one careful step toward the basement door. The wooden floor creaked under my weight, sharp and loud, and immediately the singing faltered, just for a heartbeat, before resuming, smoother than before. That pause hit me harder than any scream would have. It meant they were listening. I edged closer, flashlight angled low, illuminating the first few steps. They were old, bowed slightly in the middle from years of use. Dirt smudged the edges, packed into the corners, darker than it should have been. The beam slid farther down and then simply vanished, as if the darkness had depth, layers swallowing light instead of reflecting it. I remembered then what I'd thought earlier, that the stairs led only to dirt. I hadn't imagined that. The bottom step ended in earth, not concrete. A dead end, no room, no cellar, just packed soil. And yet the singing was coming from there. A wave of panic rolled through me, hot and dizzying. My hands went numb. I backed away again, nearly tripping over my sleeping bag, and pressed my back against the opposite wall, as if distance could make the sound less real. The church responded. That's the only way I can describe it. The air shifted, growing heavier, like a pressure change before a storm. The temperature dropped sharply, cold seeping through the soles of my boots, crawling up my legs. My breath fogged in front of me in quick, shallow bursts. Then came the knocking. It wasn't at the doors, it came from the walls. 3 slow thuds, spaced evenly apart, somewhere to my left. The sound was dull, muffled, like flesh striking wood rather than knuckles. I whipped the flashlight toward it, catching nothing but peeling paint and warped boards. Before I could process that, the knocking answered itself from the opposite wall. Same rhythm, same weight. Call and response. My denial shattered completely then, splintering into useless fragments. This wasn't something I could talk my way out of. This wasn't human behavior wearing a mask. The realization settled deep in my gut, cold and final. The church wasn't just a place where something bad was happening. The church was participating. The singing rose again, louder now, and I realized with a sick jolt that the voices were changing. Individual tones stretched and warped, vowels bending into sounds that scraped against my nerves. It wasn't harmony anymore. It was convergence, dozens of voices compressing into one impossibly full sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Floor, walls, ceiling. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, knees drawn to my chest, flashlight clenched so tightly my knuckles burned. I shut my eyes for a second, just a second, and in that darkness I saw images that weren't mine. People standing shoulder to shoulder in this very room, faces upturned, mouths open in song, eyes empty and reflective like wet stone. When I opened my eyes again, the basement door was fully open. The darkness beyond it had changed shape. It wasn't flat anymore. It bulged, pushing upward like something pressing from below. The dirt at the bottom step shifted, collapsing inward as if a weight were moving beneath it. The smell intensified, wet and ancient, filling my mouth, coating my tongue. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline finally overpowering shock. If the doors wouldn't open, I'd make them. I sprinted down the aisle, shoulders slamming into the wood again and again, pain flaring through my arm. The sound echoed uselessly, absorbed by the building. That was when the singing stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. It rang in my ears, absolute and complete, like the world had been muted. For half a second, hope flared. Maybe whatever it was had paused, retreated. Then I felt breath on the back of my neck. It wasn't warm, it wasn't cold, it was neutral, like air moving through a cave, slow, curious. I didn't turn around. Every instinct told me not to, that some things gained power the moment you acknowledge them fully. My pulse hammered so hard I thought I might black out. The breath lingered, then withdrew, replaced by a sound inches from my ear. Not a word, not a whisper, a note. Perfectly pitched, impossibly steady, vibrating through my skull more than my ears. I dropped the flashlight as my hands flew up to cover my head, a raw animal sound tearing out of my throat. The note cut off abruptly. I spun around, heart in my throat, and saw the cross at the front of the church snap free from the wall. It didn't fall. It rotated slowly, deliberately, until it pointed downward, toward the basement. The floorboards beneath my feet shuddered violently, and cracks raced outward from the altar like lightning through dry ground. Dirt pushed up between the boards, splitting them apart, fingers of soil clawing into the room. Something was coming up. Panic finally took full control. I ran. not toward the doors, but toward the side of the church, driven by pure survival instinct. I smashed through a row of pews, wood splintering, and hurled myself at a narrow window. The glass shattered outward with a sharp, blessed crash, cold night air flooding in. Hands, too many, too close, brushed my ankle, my calf, fingers rough with grit and earth. I kicked wildly, skin tearing, pain exploding, and dragged myself through the broken window frame, slicing my arms and shoulders as I fell hard onto the wet ground outside. The singing returned instantly, erupting from the church in a deafening chorus that shook the walls. I didn't look back. I crawled, then staggered to my feet, lungs burning, and ran toward the road, toward the dead VW, toward anything that wasn't that place. Behind me, the church doors burst open, not outward but inward, slamming against the walls as if thrown by something desperate to keep what it had claimed. The singing cut off mid-note. Silence rushed in again, thick and final. I reached the VW and yanked the door open, half expecting the engine to roar to life on its own. It didn't. But my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the door shut. I crouched there back against the van, eyes fixed on the church. It stood quiet now, still, harmless looking, just an abandoned building in the woods. And that terrified me more than anything else, because I knew, with the clarity that comes only after surviving something you weren't meant to, that it hadn't chased me out of anger. It had let me go. The silence didn't break when dawn came. It just thinned like fog burning off a river, leaving everything sharper and more exposed. I stayed pressed against the side of the Volkswagen for what felt like hours, knees pulled tight, back aching, eyes locked on the church across the road. Every time the wind stirred the trees, my muscles tensed, expecting the singing to spill out again, expecting the doors to move, the walls to breathe. Nothing did. The building sat there as if it had always been empty, as if it had never noticed me at all. That was the second lesson of that night. Places don't always need to move to be dangerous. When the sky finally lightened to a bruised gray, I forced myself to stand. My legs protested, stiff and numb, and I nearly fell when I tried to put weight on my right ankle. The fabric of my jeans was torn and dark with blood where something had grabbed me through the floorboards. The skin beneath was scraped raw, the marks shallow but numerous, as if many hands had brushed past, rather than one had held on. I didn't tend to the wounds right away. I didn't want to look at them too closely. Some part of me believed that acknowledging them fully might make the rest of it real in a way I wasn't ready for yet. Instead, I turned back to the church. In daylight, it looked smaller, less imposing. The paint flakes were more obvious, the steeple more crooked than ominous. The broken window gaped like a missing tooth, glass scattered across the grass. From the outside, there was no sign of what had happened inside. No cracks in the walls, no bulging floor, just a building that had outlived its congregation. I crossed the road slowly, each step deliberate, fighting the urge to bolt. I needed confirmation. Not for anyone else, just for myself. Proof that I hadn't imagined the whole thing in a spiral of fear and exhaustion. The doors stood open now, hanging slightly askew on their hinges. I hesitated at the threshold, heart rate climbing, but the air inside felt different. Cold? Yes, but flat, lifeless. The smell of damp earth was gone, replaced by dust and old wood. I didn't go far, just enough to see the altar, the pews, the floor. The boards were intact, no cracks, no displaced dirt. The basement door was shut, its surface scuffed and worn, but otherwise ordinary. The cross hung on the wall again, straight and unmoving, as if it had never turned. I stood there shaking, rage and fear tangling in my chest. It would have been easier if something had been broken, something obvious I could point to and say, "See, this happened." But the church had reset itself, erasing every sign of the night like it wiped away footprints after a storm. Except for one thing. On the inside of the front doors, carved deep into the wood where no one would see it from outside, were names. Dozens of them. They overlapped, cut into the surface with knives or nails or anything sharp enough to leave a mark. Some were neat and careful. Others jagged, rushed, as if the carver hadn't had time. I scanned them quickly, pulse pounding, recognizing nothing, and yet feeling a heavy familiarity settle over me. Near the bottom, half hidden by shadow, was a name that made my breath catch. Not mine, but close enough to feel intentional. I stumbled back out into the morning air, chest tight, and leaned hard against the VW to steady myself. Whatever had happened in that church hadn't been random. It hadn't been a trick of isolation or fear. It had been selective. A test, maybe, or a warning. The engine turned over on the first try. The sound was so sudden and loud it made me flinch. I didn't question it. I threw my gear inside, slammed the door, and pulled back onto the road without looking in the mirror. The tires kicked gravel as I drove away, the church disappearing behind a bend like it had never existed at all. I didn't stop until I reached the outskirts of a town just after sunrise. A gas station sat open on the corner, fluorescent lights humming, a single pickup truck parked by the pumps. Normalcy hit me like a wave. The smell of gasoline, the buzz of insects waking up, a man inside whistling off-key. It all felt surreal, like I'd crossed an invisible border. Inside the station, the clerk looked up as I limped to the counter. He was older, gray hair tucked under a cap, eyes sharp in a way that came from living somewhere long enough to learn its moods. "You look like you slept rough," he said, not unkindly. I almost laughed, almost cried. Instead, I nodded and asked for coffee. As he poured it, I mentioned the church. Casually, as if it were nothing more than a landmark, his hands stilled. "What church?" he asked. "The one up the hollow," I said. "White building, old, near the turnout." He studied my face for a long moment, then slid the coffee across the counter without meeting my eyes. "There ain't no church up there," he said. "Not anymore." My stomach dropped. He told me slowly and without drama about a congregation that had disbanded decades ago after a series of unexplained disappearances, people who went up the mountain and didn't come back, search parties that found nothing, a building that was supposed to have been torn down but never quite was. "Some places don't want to be empty," he said quietly, "and some doors only lock from the inside." I left without finishing the coffee. I didn't camp for months after that. When I did, I avoided Appalachia entirely, then gradually learned to listen again, to the land, to my instincts, to the quiet warnings that come before fear has a name. I learned that shelter isn't always safety, that welcome signs don't mean what you want them to mean, and that curiosity can be a form of arrogance in places older than you. I still drive that Volkswagen. I still camp, but I don't sleep in buildings I didn't see open in daylight, and I don't ignore the feeling that tells me to keep moving. Because sometimes, when the road goes quiet and the night presses in close, I remember the sound of that singing, how patient it was, how certain, and I know that somewhere in the mountains, there's a church that keeps its doors locked, not to keep people out, but to make sure they stay. The first thing I noticed was the silence, thick, deliberate, like the town itself was holding its breath and waiting for me to make a mistake. My name is Evan Mercer. I was 34 that spring, running deliveries across eastern Kentucky in an old Volkswagen camper I had rebuilt with my own hands. It wasn't a luxury rig. No slide-outs, no satellite dish. Just steel, wood, and the illusion of freedom I'd been chasing since my divorce finalized the winter before. The virus was just beginning to whisper its way into headlines, and people were already retreating into themselves. I told myself that was the reason Whitesburg felt hollow when I rolled in that evening. I told myself a lot of things back then. I parked just off Main Street at 7:42 p.m., the dashboard clock glowing a sickly green. The sun had already dipped behind the ridgeline, leaving the town in a dim blue half-light that made everything feel unfinished. Whitesburg sat low and narrow, pressed between dark hills like it had been set there by accident and forgotten. I'd been sent to deliver medical supplies, non-emergency but time-sensitive, to the small clinic near the river. Simple job. In and out. That's what I believed. Cell service dropped the moment I crossed the last bend before town. Not unusual in Appalachia, I told myself, Mountains eat signals, but it wasn't just my phone. The radio cut out too. No static, no fade, just gone. Silence rushing in like water filling a crack. I should have turned around then. That was the first instinct, a quiet nudge at the base of my spine. But I ignored it, the way I'd learned to ignore most instincts after years of convincing myself I was overreacting. That habit had cost me my marriage. It would cost me more later. I stepped out of the van and the cold surprised me. March in Kentucky isn't supposed to bite like that, but the air felt damp and sharp, crawling up my sleeves and settling against my neck. It smelled wrong too, not rot, not smoke, just stale, like the inside of a house that hadn't been opened in years. Every sound I made echoed too loudly. The crunch of gravel, the slam of the van door, even my breathing felt intrusive. Lights were on in a few storefronts, but no one was inside them. I could see shelves, posters, a tipped chair, and a diner window. Everything arranged like people had left in a hurry and never come back. I walked to the clinic first. Supplies balanced against my chest, boots scraping the pavement. The door was unlocked. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered with a faint hum, the kind that makes your teeth itch. A woman in scrubs stood behind the counter, her back to me. I said hello. She didn't turn around. I said it again, louder, still nothing. When she finally faced me, her eyes were rimmed red, not crying, strained, exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. "You're late," she said. "I'm on time," I replied, glancing at my watch. She didn't argue, just nodded once and signed the delivery slip without reading it. When I tried to ask about a place to park for the night, her expression tightened. Not fear, something closer to resignation. "You should leave before dark," she said. "It is dark," I answered. Her pen stopped moving. She looked past me toward the glass doors. "Then don't stay long." That was the second instinct, louder than the first. I left the clinic with a knot in my stomach and walked back toward the van. The town had changed in the 10 minutes I'd been inside. Lights were going out. Not all at once, one by one. A porch here, a window there, like a slow wave rolling through the streets. The hills around Whitesburg swallowed what little glow remained, and the darkness pressed closer, heavier, as if it had weight. I climbed into the driver's seat and tried the ignition. The engine coughed once, then nothing. No click, no whine. Dead. I checked the battery. Fine. Fuel gauge, half tank. I tried again. Nothing. That's when I noticed the porch light. It was on at the far end of the street, a single yellow bulb glowing steady against the dark. The house it belonged to was set back from the road, mostly hidden by trees. I hadn't seen it before. I watched it for a long moment, feeling stupid for staring, until I leaned forward to rest my elbows on the steering wheel, and the light went out. I exhaled, annoyed at myself. Then, somewhere behind me, another porch light flicked on. I turned slowly. The light was closer now. Same dull yellow. Different house. My skin prickled. I told myself it was coincidence. Power grid cycling. Old wiring. Anything but what my gut was trying to scream. I stepped out of the van and started walking. The plan, if you could call it that, was to find someone. Anyone. A mechanic. A cop. A human voice to anchor me. I passed houses with dark windows and drawn curtains. I knocked on one door, then another. No answer, no movement, no sound from inside. It was like knocking on empty shells. The porch light behind me clicked off. Another one ahead came on. My pace quickened. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the ground was resisting me. The air grew colder, the smell sharper. Something metallic crept into it, faint but unmistakable. Blood? I didn't want to believe that. I focused on the sound of my boots, the rhythm of my breathing. Don't panic. Don't invent monsters where there are none. I knocked harder on the next door. "Hello?" My voice echoed down the street, swallowed by the dark. No answer. Behind me, a light switched on. Closer. I didn't run. That's important. I wanted to. Every nerve in my body was screaming for it. But I'd learned that running turns fear into something else, something louder, less controllable. Instead, I walked faster, scanning the street for any sign of life. A television glow, a car passing, anything. Nothing answered. At the end of the block, the road dipped toward the river. Fog rolled in thick and sudden, crawling low along the ground. My breath fogged too, and I realized my hands were shaking. Not from the cold. From the certainty settling in my chest that whatever was happening here was intentional. The porch light at the end of the street turned on. I stopped. It stayed on for a long moment, then flickered twice. Slow, deliberate, like a signal. That was when I heard the knock. Not on a door, on metal. 3 soft taps echoing from behind me. I turned, heart hammering, and saw my Volkswagen camper silhouetted against the dark. And beside it, just barely visible in the fog, a porch light glowing on a house that hadn't been there before. The knock came again. Closer this time. The knock came a third time, sharper now, not tentative, expectant. And I realized with a sick drop in my stomach that it wasn't coming from my van anymore. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, afraid that any sudden movement would trigger something I couldn't undo. The fog had thickened, swallowing the street in pale layers that distorted distance and shape. The porch light across from me buzzed faintly, its glow pulsing just enough to make my eyes strain. Beneath it stood a figure. Or maybe it didn't stand. Maybe it was just where the fog bent wrong, where the light refused to settle cleanly. "Hello?" I called out, hating the way my voice cracked. No answer. The figure didn't move. But the light flickered once more, and in that brief shift I saw a face, or the suggestion of one. Too smooth, too still, like a mask pulled tight over something unfinished. I backed away, boots scraping gravel, and felt the edge of my van against my calf. Relief flared for half a second. Solid ground. Familiar metal. I reached for the driver's door, fingers numb, and that's when the knock came again, right beside my ear. I spun, heart slamming, and saw nothing. Just fog. Just the van. Just the quiet hum of that porch light across the street. I climbed into the camper and locked the doors, hands clumsy on the latches. The interior smelled like oil and old fabric, comforting, grounding. I sat there in the dark, breathing hard, listening. The knock didn't come again. Neither did any other sound. No footsteps, no voices, not even wind. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time felt elastic, stretched thin and trembling. I tried the ignition again. The engine turned this time, slow, reluctant, but it caught. The sound was thunderous in the silence, and I nearly cried with relief. I threw it into gear and pulled away from the curb, tires crunching loud enough to make my teeth hurt. As I drove, the porch lights followed. Not all of them, just one, always one. It would glow ahead of me, marking the next turn, the next street, the next bend in the road. When I passed it, it would go dark, and another would come on farther down, steady and patient, like breadcrumbs, or like eyes opening one at a time. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself the town was on some kind of timer. I told myself anything that let me keep driving without screaming. But the pattern was too clean, too deliberate. And no matter how many turns I took, left, right, looping back towards streets I thought I recognized, I never reached the highway. The road narrowed. Pavement gave way to packed dirt. Trees closed in, their branches arching overhead, blotting out what little sky remained. The fog thinned here, replaced by a heavier darkness that pressed in from all sides. My headlights carved shallow tunnels through it, illuminating trunks and roots and the occasional rusted mailbox. The porch light appeared again, hanging from a sagging post beside a house set deep in the trees. It buzzed louder here, the sound crawling through the van's thin walls and into my skull. I slowed despite myself, foot easing off the gas as if the light were pulling me toward it. "No," I whispered. The word felt small. The engine sputtered. I slammed my foot down, coaxing it forward, and the van lurched past the house. The light snapped off the moment I cleared the driveway. Darkness rushed in, complete and absolute. For a heartbeat, my headlights went out too. I screamed then. A short, raw sound torn from my chest before I could stop it. The lights came back on a second later, but the damage was done. Panic flooded my system, hot and blinding. My hands shook so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. That's when the smell hit me. Coppery, thick, fresh. It seeped through the vents, coated my tongue, made my stomach lurch. I gagged, fumbling to roll down the window, but the air outside was worse. heavier, like it had been sitting there, waiting. Shapes moved at the edge of the headlights. Not animals, too upright, too still. They didn't approach, they didn't chase, they just watched, their outlines blurring and sharpening with each pulse of my heartbeat. I thought of the nurse at the clinic, her red-rimmed eyes, her warning. I thought of all the doors that hadn't opened, all the phones that hadn't rung, a town going dark one light at a time. The road dead-ended at the river. I slammed on the brakes, the van skidding to a stop inches from the water. The river was black and swollen, moving fast, whispering over rocks like it was speaking a language just out of reach. There was nowhere left to go. Trees boxed me in on 3 sides. Water on the 4th. Behind me, the porch light flicked on. Not yellow this time. White. Harsh and bright, it cut through the dark and pinned me in place. I could see the house clearly now, too clearly. Its windows were empty holes, its door hung open, swaying slightly, knocking softly against the frame with each movement of the air. Knock, knock, knock. The sound wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. My chest tightened, breath coming in shallow gasps. Every instinct screamed to stay in the van, to lock myself in and wait it out. But another voice, quieter, steadier, cut through the panic. The same one I'd ignored earlier. The one that knew when denial had run out of road. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight, hands moving on muscle memory, and stepped out into the cold. The ground crunched beneath my boots, the sound echoing obscenely loud. The smell was strongest here, clinging to the air like a warning. I kept the flashlight trained on the house as I moved, beam jittering with each step. The light revealed scuffed dirt, broken branches, something dark staining the ground near the doorway. I didn't want to look closer. I did anyway. It wasn't blood. Not exactly. It was older, thicker, like something had seeped into the earth over time and never washed away. The knocking stopped when I reached the porch. Silence rushed in, pressing against my ears until they rang. I stood there, heart pounding, and realized with a cold clarity that no one was going to answer if I knocked. Not here, not anywhere. I backed away, turning slowly, and froze. The figures stood at the edge of the clearing now, 6 of them, spaced evenly between the trees. The porch light behind me buzzed, flared, then steadied, casting long shadows that stretched toward me like grasping fingers. The figures didn't move. They didn't need to. They had me exactly where they wanted me. I thought of my van, the river, the road that hadn't let me leave. I thought of all the times I'd ignored my instincts because it was easier than trusting them. Because doubt felt safer than certainty. Not this time. I bolted. I ran for the river, boots slipping on wet stones, breath tearing out of my lungs. The cold bit hard as I plunged in, water surging around my legs, knocking me sideways. I didn't stop. I waded, stumbled, swam. Anything to put distance between me and that light, those watching shapes. The current dragged at me, relentless, but it was honest. It didn't pretend. It didn't lure. It just moved. I let it take me. The water stole the air from my lungs the moment it closed over my chest. A shock so violent it wiped my thoughts clean. The river was ice-fed, fast and unforgiving, and it didn't care why I was there or what I was running from. It grabbed me the way the town never had, without ceremony, without intention, just force and consequence. I went under once, then again, my flashlight ripped from my hand, its beam spiraling uselessly before vanishing into the dark. The current slammed me against submerged rocks, bruising my ribs, knocking the breath from my body in short, panicked bursts. Somewhere behind me, on the bank, the white porch light flared brighter, bleaching the trees into skeletal shapes. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. I kicked and clawed and let the river drag me diagonally, remembering something my father taught me years ago on a fishing trip I'd barely cared about at the time. Never fight straight against the water. Let it spend itself first. That memory surfaced uninvited, sharp and clear, and I clung to it like a rope. By the time my boots scraped gravel on the opposite bank, my muscles were burning and my vision was tunneling. I crawled out of the river and collapsed among reeds and mud, retching water and bile until my throat felt raw. The cold soaked into my bones, but I welcomed it. Cold was real. Cold was honest. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the branches overhead, waiting for something, anything, to follow me. Nothing did. No lights, no figures, no knocking. When I finally pushed myself up, shaking and soaked, the forest on this side of the river felt different. Still dark, still quiet, but not watching. The silence here wasn't holding its breath. It was just silence. I stumbled through the trees until I found a narrow service road, barely more than a scar in the dirt. I followed it on instinct, one foot in front of the other, until headlights appeared in the distance. Real headlights, yellowed, uneven. A pickup truck rolled into view, its engine loud and clattering, the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. The driver, a man in his late 50s with a beard gone mostly gray, slammed on the brakes when he saw me. "Jesus Christ," he said, climbing out. "You fall in the river?" I tried to answer. What came out was a broken laugh that turned into a cough. He wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat me on the tailgate while he called for help on a radio that crackled and hissed but worked. As we waited, I looked back toward the trees, toward where the river bent out of sight. "Town's been acting strange," he said, following my gaze. "Ever since the cell tower went down." I opened my mouth to ask him about the lights, about the houses, about why no one answered after sunset, but the words felt wrong, dangerous, like saying them out loud would invite something to listen. An ambulance took me to a hospital 2 counties over. They treated me for hypothermia and bruised ribs and shock. A sheriff came by in the morning with a notepad and tired eyes. I told him I'd gotten lost, that my van broke down, that I panicked. He nodded like he'd heard it before. They never went back for the Volkswagen. When I asked about Whitesburg, about sending a tow truck or checking on the clinic, the nurse just shook her head. "Roads closed right now," she said. "Always seems to be at night." I left Kentucky 2 days later. I stopped delivering after that, sold the camper for parts, took a job that kept me in well-lit places with reliable signals and neighbors close enough to hear if something went wrong. On paper, my life got smaller, safer. But something else changed too. I started listening, not to every fear, not to every shadow, but to that first quiet nudge, the one that speaks before denial has time to build a case. The one I'd ignored for years because it was inconvenient, because it threatened the stories I told myself about who I was and how much control I really had. Some towns don't want you to stay. Some places don't chase you when you leave. They just wait for you to ignore the warning signs and wander back on your own. And some lights aren't meant to guide you home. So, if you ever find yourself rolling into a place where the air feels wrong, where signals die all at once, where doors stay closed and the dark seems to organize itself around you, don't argue with that feeling in your gut. Don't rationalize it away. Don't wait for proof that comes too late. Because when no one answers after sunset, it's not because they can't hear you. It's because they already know you're there. The first time I heard the bell, I was standing barefoot on frozen gravel, wondering why my breath sounded louder than the night. My name is Evan Mercer. I was 37 that winter, old enough to trust patterns and young enough to still ignore instincts when they felt inconvenient. I'd been living out of a 1978 Volkswagen Westphalia, olive green, temperamental heater, the kind of van that rattles even when parked. Except that night when it sat perfectly still, like it was holding its breath with me. I'd pulled into Bluefield just before dusk, chasing the quiet that January promises if you're willing to tolerate the cold. The campground sat just outside town limits, tucked into a shallow bowl of bare trees and black rock. Locals warned me when I fueled up, said Bluefield had a way of keeping sounds. Mountains don't let things go, the cashier told me, not unkindly. I smiled, nodded, pretended I knew what she meant. I parked with my nose facing uphill, habit drilled into me after years of rolling to places where gravity could become an enemy in the dark. The courthouse tower rose above town in the distance, pale stone against a sky already bruising purple. I noticed it the way you notice a scar on someone you'll never speak to. registered, dismissed. By 10, the temperature dropped hard. The van smelled like old vinyl, propane, and the faint metallic tang of wet boots drying too slowly. I cooked beans on the stove, listened to AM radio fade in and out, and told myself this was the point of the road. Silence that lets you hear yourself think. At 2:13 a.m., the bell rang. It wasn't loud at first. It came through the cold like a thought you're not sure is yours. A single hollow note. Then another. Slow. Measured. Each strike spaced far enough apart that denial could breathe between them. I sat up on the narrow bed, heart thudding against my ribs, counting. Bells keep time. Bells mean order. Bells have ropes and hands and reasons. This one didn't feel like any of those things. The radio crackled without warning, a burst of static sharp enough to make me flinch. I reached out and shut it off, the silence snapping back too quickly like elastic. The bell rang again. Same tone. Same distance. I pictured the courthouse tower, empty at this hour, snow dusting the steps, the rope inside cut years ago, something I'd read earlier that evening when curiosity sent me down a local history rabbit hole. Cut during renovations. Too expensive to replace. Bell kept for show. I told myself towns reuse recordings. I told myself wind does strange things in valleys. I told myself anything that would let me stay in the warmth of the van. The bell rang a fourth time, closer now. Or maybe I was listening harder. I pulled on my jacket, shoved my feet into boots stiff with cold, and stepped outside. The night smelled wrong. Not just winter, there was a sourness to it, like iron and damp paper. The campground lights flickered at the edge of vision, never fully turning off, never fully on. Trees creaked, bare branches rubbing together with a sound too similar to whispering. The bell rang again, and this time I felt it in my chest more than my ears. I walked toward the road, crunching over gravel, each step louder than it should have been. Sound traveled strangely here, some things swallowed, others amplified until they felt accusatory. I could see the courthouse tower clearly now, its clock face dark, the bell housing a black mouth against the sky. Another ring. The note seemed to bend, warping as it traveled downhill. I stopped walking. This is the part I don't like admitting, even now. I wanted it to be real. I wanted a reason to explain the heaviness pressing in on me since I arrived. There's a comfort in fear when it has a shape, a source you can point to. The unknown feels personal, like it's choosing you. The bell rang again. A light flicked on in a house near the road. Then another. Curtains shifted. I wasn't the only one hearing it. That should have comforted me. Instead, it tightened something behind my eyes, the way shared dread often does. I went back to the van and locked the doors, feeling foolish the moment the latch clicked. Metal doesn't stop sound. It doesn't stop what wants to be heard. The bell continued. Steady now, every minute on the minute. My phone said 2:19 a.m., no alerts, no messages. I checked local news, half expecting to see a headline already forming. Nothing. I lay back down, boots still on, staring at the low ceiling inches from my face. Each ring felt closer than the last, like the sound was walking toward me, step by step, learning the terrain. Between rings, I noticed something else. A smell. It seeped in through the vents, faint but undeniable. Wet earth, old leaves. And beneath that, something sweeter, wrong in the way rot sometimes is when it's been hidden too long. I held my breath, then exhaled slowly, trying to convince myself it was memory filling gaps, not air carrying truth. At 2:31 a.m., there was a knock. Just once. Soft. Knuckles on metal. I froze. Every story I'd ever heard about late-night knocks in lonely places lined up in my mind, waiting their turn. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The bell rang again, and the timing felt intentional, like punctuation. Another knock. Firmer this time. Hello? A voice called, thin and strained. Young. I sat up, heart racing, logic scrambling. Campgrounds attract strangers. Strangers need help. This is America, I told myself. We knock, we ask, we don't lurk. The bell rang. I know you're in there, the voice said. Please. I reached for the flashlight, my hand shaking enough that it clattered against the counter. The knocking stopped. Silence stretched, brittle and dangerous. I cracked the window an inch. Cold air rushed in, sharp enough to sting. "Are you okay?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. There was no one there. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, catching empty gravel, my own footprints, the outline of the road beyond. No movement, no shadow retreating, just absence, complete and absolute. The smell intensified, thick enough to make my stomach turn. The bell rang again, and this time it wasn't coming from the tower. It was closer. Too close. I slammed the window shut, locked it, and pressed my back against the door, listening as the sound echoed, not through the valley, but through the campground itself, bouncing off trees and trailers, splitting into directions my mind couldn't follow. At 2:47 a.m., sirens wailed in the distance, their rise and fall weaving with the bell until I couldn't tell which sound led and which followed. I stayed like that until dawn crept in, gray and unforgiving, revealing a campground that looked exactly as it should. Ordinary, empty, harmless, except for the footprints around my van. Small, bare, leading away toward town. And the bell rope, coiled neatly on my hood, cut clean through the middle. I didn't touch the rope at first. I stood there watching it steam faintly in the cold, like it had been somewhere warm before finding its way onto the hood of my van. The fibers were old, frayed, rough enough that I could feel the burn just by looking at it. Whoever, or whatever, had put it there hadn't done it in a hurry. There was intention in how neatly it was coiled, the cut clean and deliberate, not torn or snapped. The smell was stronger in daylight. Damp stone. Rust. That same sick, sweet note I couldn't place, clinging to the air as if the night hadn't fully let go of what it carried. I wrapped the rope in a trash bag without thinking too hard about why. Part of me wanted proof. Another part wanted to pretend I'd never seen it. Those two instincts fought quietly inside me as I started the engine, the Volkswagen coughing awake like it resented being disturbed after what it had witnessed. As I drove toward town, Bluefield looked ordinary in the way places often do after they've shown you something they shouldn't have. Brick storefronts, faded signage, coffee shops just starting to open, lights flickering on behind fogged windows. People moved with the careful efficiency of winter mornings, collars turned up, hands buried deep in pockets. No one looked shaken. That unsettled me more than panic would have. I parked 2 blocks from the courthouse, up close. The tower was smaller than it had seemed at night, less imposing, but there was a tension in the stonework that felt wrong. Hairline cracks running like veins, darkened patches where moisture had soaked in and never quite dried. The bell housing loomed above, empty. No rope, no mechanism, just the bell itself, silent now, a dull bronze shape suspended in shadow. A police cruiser idled at the curb. 2 officers stood nearby, their posture relaxed, but their eyes alert in the way that told me something had happened recently, something they hadn't finished processing yet. I didn't plan to talk to them. I told myself I'd just walk past, keep my head down, grab coffee, get back on the road. But as I moved, one of them turned and our eyes met. "You hear it?" he asked, nodding toward the tower. The question landed heavier than it should have. "Yes," I said. "Last night." His partner exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. Figures. They didn't ask me to elaborate, didn't ask where I was staying or why I was there. That silence felt like an invitation and a warning at the same time. "What happened?" I asked. The first officer hesitated, then glanced at the tower again. "They found the kid," he said finally, "down by the old drainage culvert, beneath the bell." The word beneath stuck with me. I thought of the footprints. Small, bare, leading toward town. "How old?" I asked. 17, Saki said, "missing since before Christmas." I swallowed. The smell made sense now in a way I wished it didn't. They told me that the bell had been ringing every night for weeks, same time, same interval. Complaints filed, theories floated, vandals, pranks, faulty acoustics, anything that kept it from being something else. "Did anyone ever see who rang it?" I asked. The second officer shook his head. "No rope," he said, like that settled it. I thanked them and walked away, legs heavy, the rope in the trash bag suddenly feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. My reflection in a shop window looked older than it had the night before. Eyes rimmed red, jaw tight. I found a diner a few streets over and sat in a booth by the window, nursing coffee that tasted burned and bitter. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every time the door opened, I smelled cold air and something underneath it, phantom and persistent. A woman slid into the booth across from me without asking. Late 50s, maybe. Gray hair pulled back tight. She looked like someone who had lived her whole life measuring words carefully. "You were camping up the hill," she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. She studied my face, then the window, then my hands. "You heard it up close," she said quietly. I nodded. "They always do," she said, "the ones who listen." I didn't know what to say to that. She told me the bell had been silent for decades until the boy disappeared, that the first night it rang, people thought it was a memorial recording, a tribute. Then it kept going, night after night, always the same time. "Sound carries differently when something wants to be found," she said. "That's what my daddy used to say." I asked her about the rope. Her mouth tightened. "They cut it after the coal strikes," she said. "Too many accidents, people getting hurt when the bell was rung in anger or grief. They didn't want it calling anyone anymore." The waitress came by, refilled our cups, left without comment. The woman leaned closer. "That boy," she said, "he used to climb the tower. Said he liked how the town looked from up there, like it made sense." My chest tightened. "Do you think?" I started, then stopped. I didn't want to finish the thought. She watched me carefully. "I think some places remember how to speak," she said, "and some people hear it better than others." When I left the diner, the sky had darkened again, clouds rolling in low and heavy. Snow threatened but never quite arrived. I drove back to the campground to pack up, the urge to leave overwhelming, bordering on panic. That's when I saw them. Fresh footprints. Again. Leading away from my van. This time, they didn't head toward town, they went into the trees. I stood there for a long time, engine idling, heart pounding, every rational thought screaming at me to ignore them, to leave, to choose safety over answers. But the bell had rung for weeks, long enough for someone to notice, long enough for someone to follow. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the woods. The temperature dropped immediately, the trees swallowing what little light there was. The smell returned, stronger now, mixed with pine sap and wet stone. My boots sank into mud that hadn't been there that morning. The footprints were clearer here, pressed deep, as if whoever made them had been heavy with purpose or fear. The sound came first, metallic, distant, a single note carried on air that shouldn't have been moving. The bell rang. Not from the tower, from somewhere ahead of me. I followed it, every step a negotiation with dread, the forest closing in, branches brushing my jacket like hands that didn't want to let go. The ringing grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was inside my head, vibrating against bone. I broke into a clearing and stopped short. The culvert yawned open before me, dark water trickling through, stones slick and black. Above it, strung between two trees, hung the bell, suspended by the rope I'd found on my hood. It rang once more, then fell silent, swinging gently, waiting. I stood there, frozen, understanding finally settling in my gut with sickening clarity. The bell hadn't been calling the town. It had been calling witnesses. I don't remember deciding to move. I just remember realizing that if I didn't, the clearing would swallow me whole. The bell swayed gently between the trees, its surface mottled with age and something darker near the lip, where hands had gripped it recently. The rope creaked softly, a sound that made my teeth ache. There was no wind strong enough to justify it. The forest had gone still in the way rooms do, right before someone speaks your name. I took a step back, then another, my heels sliding in the mud. The bell answered with a single deliberate ring. My chest tightened. Not fear yet, something heavier. Responsibility. That's the part no one talks about. Fear is clean compared to the weight of knowing you've been chosen because you noticed, because you listened when others closed their ears and pulled their curtains tight, because something in you has always leaned toward the unanswered sound in the night. "Stop," I whispered, not sure who I was talking to. The bell rang again. The sound carried down into the culvert, bouncing back, warped and distorted like it was ringing twice, once here, once somewhere else. The smell poured out of the dark opening now, unmistakable, thick enough to make my eyes water. I turned my face away, gagging, my body recognizing what my mind still refused to fully accept. This wasn't a warning. It was a marker. Something shifted behind me. Not a step, not a branch snapping. Just the pressure of being observed, the subtle change in air that tells you you're no longer alone. I spun, flashlight beam cutting wildly through the trees. Nothing. The forest stared back, patient. The bell rang. Closer. I backed away again, heart slamming, breath coming in sharp bursts that fogged the beam. My thoughts fractured, images of police tape, of headlines half-written, of my van sitting empty at the edge of the campground like a promise I might not keep. The rope tightened. I saw it then, the way the fibers drew taut without hands, the bell lifting slightly as if pulled upward by something beneath it, something anchored in the dark water of the culvert. The sound that followed wasn't a ring so much as a groan, metal protesting as it was asked to speak again. Panic finally broke through. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my jacket, my face, my hands. Roots reached up, catching my boots, trying to bring me down. The bell rang behind me, faster now, the rhythm collapsing into something frantic, accusatory. Each strike felt like it was aimed between my shoulder blades. I didn't look back. I knew better than that. The woods thinned abruptly, and I stumbled out into the campground, lungs burning, legs shaking so badly I nearly fell. The world snapped back into place. Trailers, picnic tables, the dull glow of a single working lamp. Ordinary things that suddenly felt fragile, temporary. The ringing stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stood there, bent over, hands on my knees, listening for anything. Sirens, voices, even the wind. Nothing came. The night pressed close, thick and heavy, as if waiting to see what I would do next. I didn't pack carefully. I threw things into the van without regard for order, hands numb, movements clumsy. The rope was still in the trash bag on the passenger seat. I didn't touch it. I couldn't. As I pulled out of the campground, the clock on the dash flicked to 2:13 a.m. My stomach dropped. The bell rang. This time it came from everywhere at once. The sound rolled through the valley, through the trees, through the metal frame of the Volkswagen, until it felt like the van itself was resonating, becoming part of the mechanism. The steering wheel vibrated under my palms. The rearview mirror shook. "Enough," I said aloud, voice cracking. The headlights caught movement at the edge of the road, a shape darting back into the trees, too fast, too light. Bare feet flashed pale against the dark ground. I hit the gas. The road twisted downhill toward town, my tires skidding slightly on frost. The bell kept time with my heartbeat now, each ring closer together, faster, as if urging me on or daring me to stop. The courthouse tower came into view, looming larger with every second. The bell housing was dark. I passed beneath it at 2:16 a.m. The ringing stopped. I drove until the sky began to lighten, until my hands stopped shaking enough to loosen their grip on the wheel. I didn't stop until Bluefield was a shape in the mirror, shrinking into the folds of the mountains. Later, days later, I learned what they found in the culvert. How the boy had been hidden, weighted down, his body placed carefully, deliberately. How someone had tried to make the water forget. They never figured out who did it. The bell never rang again. I sold the Volkswagen that spring, told myself it was practical, that I wanted something newer, safer. The truth is, I couldn't stand the way metal sounded after that, how every creak and rattle felt like it was trying to tell me something. I still camp. I still seek quiet places. But I've learned the difference between silence and listening. Some nights when I'm alone and the air is right, I hear bells in the distance, church bells, school bells, ordinary sounds with ropes and hands and reasons. They don't bother me. What stays with me is the memory of a bell that rang without a rope. Not to warn, not to mourn, but to make sure someone knew where to look. And the knowledge that if I ever hear it again, I won't pretend it's the wind. The road didn't feel wrong at first. It felt quiet, the kind of quiet that sneaks up on you only after you've already gone too far to turn back. My name is Evan Mercer. I was 36 years old that summer, living out of a faded white Volkswagen camper van. I'd rebuilt myself after a divorce that left me needing motion more than answers. During the day, I camped. At night, I drove rideshare, short trips, cash for fuel, enough human interaction to remind me I still existed. Appalachia had been good to me that way. Honest roads, honest people. At least, that's what I believed back then. That night, I picked up a request just outside Hazard, Kentucky. The app showed a 10-minute drive, easy money, last ride before I called it. The GPS recalculated twice, then told me to turn right onto a gravel road with no name. I hesitated for half a second. Gravel wasn't unusual out there. The Appalachians were stitched together with forgotten lanes and private cut-throughs. I turned. The forest closed in immediately. Trees leaned inward like they were listening. My headlights felt swallowed instead of reflected, the beams dissolving into the dark instead of bouncing back. The road was narrow, too narrow, and yet perfectly maintained, as if someone cared for it just enough to keep it usable, but not enough to acknowledge it publicly. The smell hit next. Damp earth, old leaves, something metallic underneath. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The van's engine hummed steady, loyal, familiar. I trusted that sound. It had carried me through deserts, snowstorms, loneliness. I trusted it more than the app glowing on my dashboard. The GPS voice told me to continue straight for 2 miles. No cross streets, no mailboxes, no reflectors. Just gravel crunching under tires and the slow realization that my phone signal bars had vanished without a sound. I told myself it was fine. Appalachia did that. Dead zones were normal. So was discomfort when you weren't used to stillness. I rolled down the window a crack. The air was cold in a way that didn't match August, sharp against my skin, carrying a faint smell of smoke that didn't belong to any fire I could see. Then the houses started. They appeared suddenly, spaced evenly on either side of the road, set back just far enough to watch without being watched. Every single one had a porch light on. Yellow, steady, no flicker, no shadows moving behind curtains, no cars in the driveways, no sounds, no insects, no dogs. I slowed to a crawl. My headlights swept across windows, revealing furniture inside, tables, couches, picture frames, lived-in spaces, but no people, not even the suggestion of movement. The GPS recalculated again, then froze. The app showed my van as a blue dot floating in blank gray space, like I'd driven off the edge of the world. That's when I felt it, the pressure. Not fear yet, pressure. Like the air had thickened, like every mile forward added weight to my chest. I thought about turning around. I checked the mirror. The road behind me looked different, narrower, longer. The curve I'd come around was gone, replaced by a straight stretch that disappeared into darkness. I told myself it was just perspective, just nerves. I kept driving. The pickup location was supposed to be at the end of the road. The houses continued, identical but not identical. Same shape, different decay. One had peeling paint. One had a porch step cracked clean in half. One had a child's tricycle lying on its side in the yard, rusted enough to tell me it hadn't moved in years. All the lights were still on. I honked once, lightly, to announce myself. The sound died fast, like the trees swallowed it. I pulled over in front of the pin location. The app insisted I had arrived. There was a house there, 2 stories, white siding, porch light brighter than the others. The front door was open. I waited. A minute passed, then 2. I texted the rider, "I'm here." No reply. That's when I noticed the smell again, stronger now. Smoke and copper, and something else, something sour that made the back of my throat tighten. The porch light flickered, just once. I don't know why I got out of the van. Every instinct told me not to. But there's a stubborn part of me that hates unfinished things. A part that still believed logic could explain everything if I just looked closely enough. The gravel crunched loud under my boots, too loud. I walked a few steps toward the house and called out, "Rideshare for..." I stopped. There were footprints on the porch, dozens of them, bare feet. Adult size, child size, overlapping, smeared into the wood like they'd been pacing back and forth for a long time. And they all pointed inward, toward the open door. My phone vibrated, no signal, but a notification anyway. Ryder has been waiting for 5 minutes. I backed away slowly, eyes locked on the doorway. The inside of the house was dark, but darker than it should have been, like the light refused to go there. I felt watched, not from the house, but from everywhere else, from the trees, from the other homes, from the road itself. I turned to get back in the van. That's when I heard the knocking. Not on the house, on my van. 3 slow taps coming from the inside of the cargo area. I froze. My breath sounded wrong in my ears, too loud, too fast. I knew every sound that van made. I knew how it settled when cooling. I knew the creaks of old metal. This wasn't that. 3 more taps. Deliberate. Patient. I told myself it had to be an animal, a branch. Anything that didn't require me to accept what my body already knew. I unlocked the driver's door and slid inside, hands shaking so hard I fumbled the key. The knocking followed me. Now closer, like fingers dragging along the side panel. Testing. I started the engine. The headlights flickered. The porch lights up and down the road went out all at once. The engine stalled, and in the sudden darkness, the knocking stopped. Silence pressed in so tight it felt like my ears were filling with water. I tried the ignition again. Nothing. From somewhere ahead of me down the road that didn't exist on any map, I heard footsteps on gravel. Slow, uneven, many of them, moving closer. And then a voice, soft and almost kind, floated through the trees and settled against my window. "You took the wrong turn, Evan." My name had never been on the app. My name in someone else's mouth felt heavier than the dark. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth, dry as chalk. The van's dashboard lights flickered weakly, like they were afraid to stay on too long. Outside, the gravel footsteps slowed, then stopped just beyond the reach of my headlights. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel them, presence without shape, weight without form. "You can turn around," the voice said, closer now, male. Middle-aged, calm in a way that didn't belong out here. Most folks do. I tried the key again. The engine coughed, sputtered, then died. Panic rose sharp and fast, clawing at my chest. I forced myself to breathe slower. Fast breathing makes bad decisions. I'd learned that camping alone in places where help was hours away. I reached for my phone. No signal, no bars, but the screen was still on, still glowing, still insisting I was on a road that didn't exist. The voice moved. I heard gravel shift to my left, then behind me. Not one set of feet, several. They didn't rush. They took their time, like time was something they had plenty of. I cracked the window an inch, just enough to speak. "Look," I said, my voice thinner than I wanted. "I'm just a driver. Wrong turn. I'll head back the way I came." A pause, then soft laughter. Not mocking, almost sympathetic. "There is no back," the voice said. "Not anymore." Something brushed the side of the van. Fingertips, maybe. Or nails. The metal skin shivered under the touch. I slammed the window shut and locked the doors, the sound echoing too loudly in the stillness. I thought about running, about abandoning the van and sprinting into the trees, but the forest didn't feel like an escape. It felt like a mouth. The headlights flickered again, then stabilized. In that brief pulse of light, I saw them. Figures standing in the road. They weren't close enough to make out faces, but I could see their posture. Too straight. Too still. Some were barefoot, some weren't. Their clothes looked outdated, mismatched, like they'd been pulled from different decades and thrown together without care. One of them stepped forward, into the full beam of my headlights. It was a woman, maybe late 20s, early 30s. Her eyes reflected the light wrong, too bright, too empty. She smiled like she was trying to remember how. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said. Her voice was different from the first man's, softer, sadder. "The road only keeps you while you're moving." The smell grew stronger, smoke, copper, rot. My stomach turned. "What do you want?" I asked, the question ripping out of me before I could stop it. She tilted her head. "A ride," she said. "Isn't that what you're here for?" Behind her, the others shifted. I counted 6, then 8, then lost track. The app chimed. Rider entering vehicle. The passenger door handle twitched. I screamed and slammed my shoulder into the door, holding it shut as the handle rattled violently, like someone was testing the lock with growing irritation. The van rocked slightly, suspension groaning under sudden weight, as if hands were pressing against it from all sides. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." The knocking returned, louder now, coming from everywhere at once, on the windows, on the roof, on the rear doors. Not frantic, rhythmic, coordinated. I shut my eyes and did the only thing I could think of. I hit the horn. The sound tore through the night, ugly and loud and human. It broke the rhythm. The knocking faltered. The figures recoiled slightly, like the noise hurt them. I didn't wait. I turned the key again, foot hard on the gas. This time, the engine roared to life. I floored it. The van lurched forward, gravel spraying as I plowed straight through where they'd been standing. I didn't feel a bump. No impact, just cold, like driving through fog that pressed back. The road stretched ahead, longer than it should have been, houses blurring past faster now. Porch lights flicked on again one by one, like eyes opening. The GPS woke up. "Turn left," it said, cheerful and wrong. I ignored it. The road narrowed, trees closing in so tight their branches scraped the sides of the van, screeching like metal on bone. The temperature dropped sharply, breath fogging the windshield. My hands were numb on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the houses were gone. The road behind me was filled with people. They didn't chase, they walked. Certain. I pushed the van harder, engine screaming in protest. A warning light flashed, oil pressure. Then another, temperature. I begged the engine out loud, promising maintenance, promising rest, promising anything if it would just keep going. The road dipped suddenly, steep and sharp. At the bottom, water glimmered in my headlights, a creek crossing, swollen and fast-moving. No bridge. I didn't slow down. Cold water surged up over the tires, then the hood. The engine sputtered, screamed, then died as the van rolled to a stop midstream. Water pressed against the doors, icy and relentless. I looked back. The figures stood at the edge of the water, unmoving, watching. The woman stepped forward, stopping just short of the creek. "You can stay," she called. "It's quieter if you stay." The water climbed higher. I grabbed my backpack, shoved the door open against the current, and plunged into the creek. The cold stole my breath instantly, shock burning through my limbs. I fought my way across, boots slipping on slick stones, water dragging at my legs like hands trying to pull me under. I didn't look back until I reached the far bank. They were gone. The road on the other side was paved, real, familiar. My phone buzzed as signal bars snapped back into place. Notifications flooded in, missed calls, texts, app alerts. Behind me, the creek flowed quietly, empty and ordinary. No gravel road, no houses, just forest. I stood there shaking, soaked to the bone, listening to my own heartbeat slowly settle back into something human. I walked until I reached a gas station just before midnight. The clerk looked at me like I'd crawled out of a grave. "You okay, man?" he asked. I nodded, paid cash, didn't tell him anything. I never reported the ride. I sold the van 2 weeks later. I still camp, still drive, still love the road. But when the GPS tells me to turn onto a road with no name, no history, no signal, I keep driving. Because some roads don't lead anywhere new. They just decide whether you're coming back. I didn't sleep for 3 days after that night, not really. I lay on a borrowed couch at a friend's place outside Lexington, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun slow circles above me, each rotation dragging the road back into my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I smelled wet gravel and copper. Every time I drifted, I heard knocking, not loud, not urgent, just patient, like it knew I'd answer eventually. People think survival stories end when you get away. They don't. Escape is just the moment your body stops running. Your mind keeps going long after. I told myself the logical version first, that it was exhaustion, that the mountains mess with your perception, that I'd driven onto private land, stumbled into some backwoods prank, maybe a drug operation meant to scare outsiders off. Appalachia has its secrets, and I didn't want to insult the place by pretending it didn't. But logic doesn't explain how they knew my name. Logic doesn't explain the footprints all facing inward. Logic doesn't explain why the creek wasn't on any map, or why the gas station clerk, who'd lived there his whole life, went pale when I mentioned a gravel road near Hazard with houses and porch lights. "There's nothing out that way," he'd said carefully. Not anymore. That word stuck with me. Anymore. A week later, I drove back in daylight. I needed proof of something, anything that grounded the memory. I parked on the shoulder near where the GPS claimed the turn had been. There was no road, just trees. Thick, uninterrupted forest. No tire marks, no gravel, no sign anyone had passed through there in years. I stood there longer than I should have, listening. The woods sounded normal. Birds, wind, life. But underneath it all, I felt it again. That pressure, like the land itself, was aware of being observed. I left without stepping off the pavement. That was the first lesson the road taught me. Some places don't need to exist to take something from you. I stopped driving rideshare after that. Not because I was afraid of people, but because I was afraid of directions. Afraid of trusting something that had no stake in my survival. GPS doesn't feel fear. It doesn't hesitate. It doesn't sense when the air goes wrong or the silence gets too deep. I started camping differently, too. I used to chase isolation, the more remote the better. Now I camp where there are stories, where people still talk to each other, where the land remembers being shared. I listen more. To locals. To my gut. To the small, quiet signals I used to dismiss as nerves. Because the truth is, the road didn't trick me. I ignored myself. I ignored the way the trees leaned inward too early, the way the air cooled too fast, the way the houses looked lived in but unlived by. I ignored the fact that the road felt maintained by intention, not use. And that's the second lesson. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it invites you politely and waits for you to say yes. I still dream about them sometimes. Not chasing me. Not angry. Waiting. Standing just beyond the headlights, confident in the patience of stone and time. In the dreams, the woman smiles the same sad smile, and the man's voice still sounds almost kind when he tells me I can turn around. But there's always something different. In the dreams, I hesitate. I think about stopping, about opening the door, about finishing the ride. I wake up before I decide. That's the third lesson, and the hardest one to live with. Not every escape is permanent. Some roads remember you. Some places don't need you to come back physically to keep a hold on you. I don't tell this story to scare people away from camping or driving or trusting the road. I tell it because the road is honest in its own way. It reflects back what you bring into it, your patience, your arrogance, your willingness to listen. The night I took that turn, I was tired, lonely, rushing toward an ending I hadn't earned yet. The road didn't create that weakness. It recognized it. And it offered me a place to stay. So if you're out there someday, RV humming steady beneath you, miles from anywhere, and your GPS tells you to turn onto a road with no name, one that feels too quiet, too clean, too intentional, pay attention to what your body does before your mind catches up. Notice the silence. Notice the smell. Notice whether the land feels like it's watching or waiting, because not every road is meant to take you forward. Some of them are just asking a question, and once you answer it, the map won't matter anymore. I learned something that evening that I wish I could unlearn, that some places don't just hold the dead, they watch the living. My name is Elliot Harper. I was 39 years old then, a lifelong roadman, the kind who believed was safer than staying still. I'd been RV camping for nearly 15 years by that point, drifting through national parks, forgotten campgrounds, coal towns that time had left behind like an unfinished sentence. I told myself I camped for freedom, for silence, for the way the world feels honest when all you have is four wheels, thin walls, and whatever courage you packed with you. In October of 2014, that honesty led me to Wise, Virginia. The plan was simple. 3 nights. No hookups, no crowds, just a small, unnamed campground tucked against the edge of the Jefferson National Forest. The kind of place you find not because it's advertised, but because someone lowers their voice when they mention it, like they're not sure it wants to be found. I arrived at 4:30 p.m., the sun already sagging low, staining the hills a tired copper color. The air smelled like damp leaves and old iron. Not unpleasant, just heavy, like it had been sitting there a long time, waiting for someone to breathe it in. The campground itself was mostly empty. 2 cleared pads, a rusted fire ring, a picnic table warped like it had been twisted by hands stronger than weather. No ranger station, no signs, just a narrow gravel spur off the main road and a sense that I'd crossed some invisible line where help didn't come quickly. I parked my old Volkswagen Rialta facing the tree line, engine ticking as it cooled, and that's when I noticed the cemetery. It sat just uphill from the campground, half hidden by scrub oak and tangled brush. Small, old. The stones were crooked, some sunken so deep only the tops showed, names chewed away by lichen and time. A low iron fence leaned outward as if even it wanted distance from what it was meant to contain. I told myself it was common enough. Appalachia is full of forgotten graveyards. Families bury their own, land changes hands, memory erodes. Still, I felt watched. I shook it off, set up camp, ran a quick systems check. By the time I finished, the light had thinned into that bluish dusk where shadows stopped behaving correctly. I needed water, and I remembered seeing a hand-painted sign for a general store about a mile back down the road. The drive took less than 5 minutes. The store looked like it had been assembled from leftovers. 1 gas pump, flickering fluorescent lights, a screen door that slapped shut behind me like a warning. Inside, the air smelled of coffee that had burned hours ago and something sharper underneath. Antiseptic, maybe, or soil. Behind the counter stood an old man with a back bent by decades, not age. His hands were thick, stained dark at the nails, dirt that never quite comes out. He didn't greet me, just watched. I grabbed water, a can of soup, and a pack of batteries. When I set them on the counter, his eyes flicked to my jacket, then to the mud on my boots. "You staying up the spur?" he asked. I nodded. "Couple nights." That earned me a look I'd seen before. Not fear, not anger, something closer to resignation. "Ground's restless this time of year," he said. I smiled, the polite kind you give when locals get poetic. "I'll try not to bother it." That's when he leaned forward, elbows creaking, and lowered his voice. "They don't bury everyone up there." I laughed. I shouldn't have. But I did. Reflex. Armor. He didn't smile back. "Cemetery?" I asked, more to fill the silence than from curiosity. He nodded once. "I dug there. Years back." That made me pause. "You're the gravedigger?" "Was," he said, before I stopped asking questions. The store seemed quieter then, like even the lights were listening. "What do you mean?" I asked. He reached under the counter and pulled out my change, setting it down carefully, deliberately, like the weight of the coins mattered. "Some coffins come in light," he said. "Too light, you notice when you've carried enough of them." My mouth went dry. I wanted to tell myself he was messing with me, spinning a story for a stranger who'd be gone by morning. But his hands were shaking. "You ever see a grave after rain?" he asked. "Mud don't lie. Neither do footprints." I followed his gaze to the door where dusk pressed its face against the glass. "They don't all stay put," he finished. I left without another word. Back at the campground, night fell fast. The forest swallowed the last of the light like it had been waiting all day. I cooked soup on the stove inside the RV, ate standing up, every sense tuned outward. The wind moved through the trees in uneven breaths. Leaves scraped along the side of the vehicle, slow, deliberate. At around 8 p.m., I shut off the interior lights. Darkness closed in immediately. Not just outside, inside too. The windows turned into mirrors, reflecting my own face back at me, pale and uncertain. That's when I heard it. A sound from uphill, metal, a dull, dragging scrape followed by a soft thud, then another. I told myself it was a branch, a fallen fence section, an animal knocking into something it shouldn't, but it came again. Scrape, thud, always in pairs. I cracked the door open just enough to let the cold air spill in. The smell hit me first, wet earth freshly turned, stronger than before. I stepped out, The cemetery gate was open, Gertner. I was sure it had been closed earlier. I remembered the way it leaned, the chain looped uselessly around the post. Now the chain lay in the grass. I took a flashlight from the RV and climbed the short rise, boots sinking into ground that felt softer than it should have. The beam cut through headstones, catching names, dates, gaps where markers should have been. And then I saw the dirt. One grave near the back had collapsed inward. The soil caved like something had pushed up from below. The coffin lid inside was open. Empty. My chest tightened. I stood there longer than I should have, staring, waiting for my eyes to correct the image. They didn't. That's when I noticed the footprints. Bare feet, leading away from the grave, straight into the woods. They were fresh, still filling slowly with water from the mist settling in. I followed them to the tree line without meaning to, like my body had decided before my mind caught up. The forest beyond was black, dense, swallowing the beam of my flashlight after just a few yards. The footprints stopped where the leaves began. No return trail, no sign of struggle. Just absence. Behind me, something shifted, not in the woods, in the cemetery. I turned slowly, heart hammering, light shaking in my hand. Every grave looked the same as before, except one more had sunk. I backed away, step by careful step, until my heel caught on a stone and I nearly fell. I didn't run, I should have, but running feels loud in places that are listening. I locked myself in the RV that night, every latch, every bolt. I didn't sleep, not really. I lay there with the lights off, listening to sounds that might have been wind or might not have been. Around 2:17 a.m., something knocked on the side of the vehicle. Once, twice. Bare skin on metal, slow. Testing. I held my breath until my lungs burned, staring at the door, knowing, deep down, that whatever was outside knew exactly where I was, and that it was waiting for me to decide what to do next. I stayed frozen in that narrow space between thought and instinct, where every sound feels louder because your body is begging you to react and your mind is screaming not to. The knocking didn't come again right away. That scared me more than if it had kept pounding. Whatever was out there wasn't impatient. It wasn't confused. It had learned the shape of the RV already, learned where the hollow sounded different from the solid, learned where I was lying. Minutes dragged by without mercy. The forest settled into a false calm, like a held breath. I told myself, quietly, stubbornly, that I was overreacting, that the old man's story had primed me for paranoia, that fear loves coincidence, that bare footprints could belong to a prank, a drunk, a hunter who'd lost his boots. I stacked rational explanations like sandbags against a flood I could already feel pushing through the cracks. Then the smell came back, not through the vents, not on the wind. It crept inside, thick and unmistakable, raw soil, rot, and something sour beneath it, like a body left too long in a place it didn't belong. My stomach turned. I pressed my sleeve to my nose, breathing shallow, afraid that drawing in too much air would make it worse. The knock came again, higher this time, near the window. I rolled onto my side, inch by inch, until my eye lined up with the glass. I didn't pull the curtain back. I didn't need to. The shadow blocked what little moonlight there was, tall enough to eclipse it completely. A hand slid across the window. No nails, just smooth, pale skin, smeared with mud. It moved slowly, almost thoughtfully, as if feeling the temperature difference between inside and out. I bit down hard to keep from making a sound, tasting blood as my teeth caught my lip. The hand withdrew. Footsteps followed, soft, wet, unhurried, circling the RV. Each step pressed into the ground with a sound like suction, the earth reluctant to let go. I tracked it by sound alone, counting breaths, mapping distance, praying it wouldn't stop at the door. It did. I squeezed my eyes shut, not out of fear of seeing it, but because seeing would make it real in a way I couldn't undo. The handle rattled once, gently, not a test, a confirmation. Locked. A long pause followed. In that silence, I felt something else. Pressure. Not physical, emotional. Like being watched from very close range, like a face inches from mine, even though I knew there was metal and insulation between us. Then, right beside my ear, came a sound I will never forget. Breathing. Not mine. Wet. Shallow. curious. I don't know how long it stayed there. Time stopped behaving normally. Seconds stretched until they felt like hours, then collapsed without warning. At some point, the pressure lifted. The breathing faded. The footsteps retreated toward the cemetery, slower now, dragging. Only then did I realize my hands were numb from gripping the edge of the mattress. Dawn came without ceremony. Gray light seeped into the RV, revealing the ordinary shapes of my life: cup, jacket, steering wheel, made strange by how fragile they suddenly felt. I sat up stiffly, every muscle protesting, and listened. Birds called. Wind stirred leaves. The world pretended nothing had happened. I stepped outside just after 6 a.m. The ground around the RV was churned with prints. Bare feet, big ones, small ones, too many to count. They led uphill, back to the cemetery. I followed at a distance, heart thudding, telling myself I was doing this so I could leave with answers instead of fear. That lie barely held together. 3 graves had collapsed overnight. All 3 coffins were open. All 3 were empty. The footprints radiated outward like spokes, vanishing into the woods in different directions, none of them returning. I felt suddenly acutely aware of how alone I was. No cell service, no neighbors, just forest and dirt, and the knowledge that whatever walked last night didn't need daylight to move. I packed fast, too fast. I dropped things, fumbled locks, cursed my shaking hands. The urge to flee overrode every other thought. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and nothing happened. The engine clicked once. Then again. Dead battery. I laughed then, a short, broken sound that didn't feel like it belonged to me. Of course, this was how it would go. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, breathing through the panic, forcing myself to think. There was a downhill slope. If I could get enough roll, maybe. A shadow crossed the windshield. I looked up. Someone stood at the edge of the tree line, too far to see clearly, close enough to know they were watching. They didn't wave, didn't move, just stood there, head tilted like they were studying something unfamiliar. I shoved the door open and shouted, voice cracking, "Hey!" The figure took a step forward, then another. Each step was careful, deliberate, like walking on ground that still felt wrong beneath their feet. As they came closer, details emerged, skin stretched too tight over bone, eyes sunken deep, clothes hanging loose and dirt darkened, funeral clothes. More than one set. Layers. Behind them, shapes moved between the trees. More shadows, more watchers. Something inside me broke loose then. Not fear, clarity. The kind that arrives when denial finally exhausts itself. I slammed the door shut, released the brake, and let gravity do the work. The RV lurched forward, rolling downhill faster than I expected, faster than I wanted. I wrestled the wheel, heart in my throat, as branches scraped along the sides like grasping hands. In the rearview mirror, I saw them step aside. They didn't chase. They watched. The road caught me like a lifeline. Tires hit pavement. I didn't stop until I reached the general store, skidding into the lot like a man running out of air. The old man was there, sweeping the porch. He looked up, unsurprised. "They followed you out?" he asked. I nodded, unable to speak. He set the broom down slowly. "Then you're lucky." I wanted to ask questions. 1,000 of them. Instead, I asked the only one that mattered. "Why?" He met my eyes. Some ground won't hold what it's given. Some dead don't stay buried, and some places. His gaze flicked toward the hills. Remember the living better than the living. Remember them. He helped me jump the battery. I left Wise an hour later and never returned. But the lesson followed me. I don't camp near old cemeteries anymore. I don't ignore smells that don't belong. I don't laugh when locals lower their voices. And when the night presses too close, when the forest feels like it's leaning in to listen, I leave. Because I learned something in those hills. They don't bury everyone. And sometimes the ones they don't bury are still looking for a way back. I thought leaving Wise meant leaving it behind. But places like that don't let go just because you put miles between you and them. The road carried me west, then south, the scenery changing the way it always does. Gas stations, diners, anonymous exits. But something inside me stayed fixed on that slope above the campground, on the way those figures watched without urgency, without hunger, like patience itself had learned how to walk. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep in the RV without lights on. Every rest stop felt temporary in the worst way, like I was trespassing somewhere I hadn't been invited to yet. Sounds took on new weight. A knock from inside the engine bay would freeze me in place. The smell of damp earth after rain made my chest tighten until I had to remind myself where I was. I told no one the full story. Not friends. Not fellow campers. I learned quickly that there's a way people smile when they stop believing you, and I couldn't stand that smile being attached to something that had crawled under my skin and rearranged the furniture. Winter came early that year. By November, I was camped outside a small state park in eastern Tennessee, trying to convince myself that routine would stitch me back together. Same setup, same checks, same rituals. I parked farther from the trees than usual. I chose sites with lighting. I avoided anywhere that smelled old. It worked. Mostly. Until one night around 11:40 p.m. when I heard footsteps outside the RV. They weren't dragging this time. They were measured. I sat up slowly, heart pounding, listening. The steps stopped near the rear bumper. I waited for the knock. It didn't come. Instead, I heard something else, a soft scuff like fingers brushing dirt. Rationality surged up, desperate to reclaim ground. Probably a raccoon, maybe another camper, maybe my nerves, still raw, turning shadows into threats. I opened the door. The campground was empty, silent. My breath fogged in the cold air, hanging there longer than it should have. I swept my flashlight across the ground. Bare footprints, fresh, leading away from the RV, not toward it. Relief hit me first. Hot and disorienting. They were leaving. Whatever it wasn't trying to get in. But relief didn't last. Because as I followed the prints with the beam, my stomach dropped. They weren't random. They were careful. They avoided roots, stepped around stones, traveled in a straight, purposeful line toward the tree line, toward a stand of woods I knew from the map bordered an old burial ground no longer marked on modern charts. I didn't follow this time. That was the lesson wise carved into me deeper than fear ever could. Curiosity is a luxury. Instinct is a debt. And some debts, once ignored, demand interest. I backed into the RV, locked the door, and left before sunrise. Over the next year, the pattern repeated. Not often, not predictably, but enough to make denial impossible. Always near old ground, always after rain, always footprints that appeared where they shouldn't and disappeared where they couldn't. Never faces, never voices, just reminders. I started researching, quietly, county records, old newspapers, church registries. I learned about pauper graves, about unmarked burials during mining accidents, epidemics, winters too hard to dig through, about coffins reused, bodies moved, names lost, and about stories, whispered, dismissed, of the dead who weren't finished with where they'd been put. The gravedigger's words came back to me then, sharper with time. Some ground won't hold what it's given. I realized something else too, something that settled heavy in my chest. Whatever I'd seen, whatever followed me, wasn't hunting. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even lost in the way we think of loss. It was unfinished. We like to believe burial is an ending, a closing of accounts, dirt over a problem we don't know how to solve. But in places where history was rushed, where lives were counted cheaply, the ground remembers the shortcuts we took, and sometimes it opens. The last time it happened was 2 years after Wise, in a quiet campground in western Kentucky. I woke before dawn with the smell of soil in my lungs and the certainty, absolute, unarguable, that something was standing just beyond the door. I didn't check. I didn't need to. I spoke instead, softly, calmly, like you would to a frightened animal or a child who doesn't know how to ask for help. "I can't help you," I said, "but I see you." The pressure lifted, the smell faded. When I stepped outside later, the ground was untouched. No prints, no sign. Just dew and leaves and the ordinary mercy of morning. I sold the RV the following spring, not because I was afraid of the road, but because I understood it better now. RV camping teaches you something if you listen long enough, that walls are thin, that comfort is temporary, that the land doesn't owe you peace just because you parked on it. I still camp, just differently. I choose places with stories that have been told all the way through. I listen when locals hesitate. I leave offerings of respect instead of assumptions. And when the ground feels wrong, when the air presses close and the silence leans in, I don't argue. I leave. Because I've learned that fear isn't always a warning about danger. Sometimes it's a reminder that not everything buried is at rest, that not every place wants witnesses, and that some footsteps are meant to be seen, not followed, so you remember where you're standing and why you shouldn't stay there too long. They don't bury everyone, and once you know that, you never camp the same way again. The first thing I noticed was how quiet the air felt, like it was holding its breath. My name is Evan Mercer. I was 38 years old in the spring of 2021, and I had been living out of my restored 1978 Volkswagen Westfalia for nearly 3 years by then. I wasn't running from anything. That's what I told myself anyway. I was just someone who believed the road had a way of sanding the sharp edges off a life that had grown too predictable. Campgrounds were my rhythm. Small towns were my punctuation marks. And Appalachia, especially eastern Kentucky, had always pulled at me with a kind of gravity I couldn't explain. Paintsville was supposed to be a 2-night stop, nothing more. Just a quiet campground outside town near the Levisa Fork, a place where the hills folded over each other like knuckles, and the evenings smelled of damp leaves and coal dust. I rolled in around 6:15, the sun already slanting low, staining everything amber and tired. My engine ticked as it cooled, that familiar Volkswagen sound, metal settling like a creature curling up to sleep. That should have been comforting. It usually was. But that evening, even before I shut the door, I felt watched. Not in a dramatic way, not like something was about to leap out of the woods. It was subtler than that. Like I'd walked into the middle of a conversation that had stopped just before I arrived. The campground was nearly empty. One aging fifth wheel at the far end, curtains drawn, no kids, no laughter, no radios humming, just the low drone of cicadas warming up for the night. I stepped out, stretched my legs, and the smell hit me. Old paper, mildew, something faintly sweet and wrong underneath it. It didn't belong outside. It smelled like an abandoned library. I told myself it was the river. I always told myself something. Paintsville itself was small, tighter than it looked on the map. I drove into town to grab groceries, passing houses that seemed to lean inward, porches sagging under decades of watching. People stared. Not aggressively, just long enough to register me, then look away as if I'd already overstayed my welcome. Inside the grocery store, an older man at the register noticed my plates and asked where I was staying. When I told him, his smile thinned. He nodded once, slow. "Don't walk after dark," he said, like it was advice you gave to someone visiting a city with bad traffic. I laughed it off. Didn't plan on it. He hesitated, fingers resting on the counter. "If you hear kids," he added, quieter now, "you mind your business." That was the moment unease found its first foothold. Back at the campsite, twilight drained the color from the hills. I cooked a simple meal, ate sitting on the bumper of VW, listening to the cicadas rise and fall in waves. That's when I heard it, the sound that didn't belong. Laughter, 3 voices, children, close enough to be just beyond the tree line. I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth. It wasn't playful laughter. It wasn't wild either. It was rehearsed, like they were repeating something they'd heard before, mimicking joy without understanding it. The sound came in short bursts, then stopped all at once as if someone had given a signal. I stood slowly, heart tapping against my ribs. "Hello?" I called, feeling ridiculous the second the word left my mouth. No answer. The woods swallowed sound differently there. Everything felt padded, muted, like the forest had been designed to keep secrets. I waited, counting my breaths, until the cicadas reclaimed the silence. I told myself it was local kids cutting through the campground. I told myself a lot of things that night. Sleep didn't come easily. The Westfalia rocked gently in the breeze, shadows stretching and shrinking across the canvas pop-top. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Small, light, circling the van. Not running, walking. I held my breath, every muscle locked. The steps stopped near the driver's side door. A pause, then a knock. Soft, polite. 3 taps. My stomach tightened in a way I hadn't felt since childhood, since nights when fear came from places you couldn't name. I didn't move. The knock came again, same rhythm. I waited until the sound faded, until the forest reclaimed its voice. Morning brought fog thick enough to make the world feel unfinished. I drove into town early, needing to ground myself in daylight and people. That's when I found the Historical Society. It was a squat brick building with faded banners and a handwritten sign that said "Open." Inside, it smelled exactly like the night before. Old paper, mildew, that faint sweetness. A woman behind the desk looked up, startled, like she hadn't expected anyone. "I'm just passing through," I said, "camping nearby." Her eyes flicked up, sharp. "At the river?" I nodded. She didn't smile. "You should see our archives," she said instead, "if you're interested in local history." I don't know why I agreed. Maybe I wanted answers before I'd fully formed the question. She led me into a back room lined with shelves of yearbooks, stacked and labeled by decade. "We get requests sometimes," she said, running her fingers along the spines. "Family trees, missing persons, things like that." She pulled one book free and opened it on the table. "Look," she said. The photo showed a class of children, smiling stiffly, arranged in neat rows. My eyes scanned faces, then snagged on 3 in the front row. 2 boys and a girl, all around 10 years old. Dark hair, pale eyes, identical expressions. Not smiles, exactly, but the suggestion of one. She flipped to another year, then another. They were there every time, same clothes, same height, same faces. "Printing error," she said quickly, like she was reciting a line she'd practiced. "They reused plates back then." 40 years in a row?" I asked. She closed the book. "People see what they want to see." But I couldn't unsee them. When I left, the fog had burned off, replaced by a brittle, glaring sun. I drove back to the campground with the windows down, trying to shake the image of those faces. Halfway there, I saw them. 3 children standing by the road. They waved as I passed. They looked exactly like the photos. Same clothes, same expressions, same age. My foot slammed the brake before my brain caught up. The van skidded to a stop. When I looked again, the road was empty. That night, the laughter came earlier, closer. And this time, when the knock sounded on my door, a child's voice spoke my name. Not shouted, remembered. And that was when denial finally cracked, just enough to let the dread seep in. I didn't answer when the voice said my name, because answering would have meant admitting that whatever stood outside my door knew me well enough to use it. The silence afterward felt heavier than the knock itself, not empty, loaded, like the air had been packed tight with intention. I lay there in the narrow bed of the Westphalia, staring at the ceiling canvas, listening to my own heartbeat try to argue its way back into a normal rhythm. My mind kept searching for explanations that felt reasonable. Locals messing with a stranger, kids who'd learned my name from town, coincidence stacked on coincidence until it only felt impossible. Rationalization is a powerful drug. It lets fear stay theoretical. Another knock came, closer to the window this time. Same rhythm, 3 taps. "Evan," the voice said again, clearer now. A girl's voice, soft, calm, not pleading, not playful, just patient. I clenched my eyes shut. Somewhere deep inside me, something old and instinctive was screaming not to look, not to engage, not to complete whatever circle this moment was trying to draw me into. I'd trusted strangers before, trusted the road, trusted that curiosity would always be rewarded with insight instead of consequence. That belief was starting to rot. The knocking stopped. Footsteps retreated, light and unhurried, fading into the trees. I waited for laughter, for running. For any sign this was just kids playing games. None came. Sleep, when it finally took me, was shallow and fractured. I dreamed of school hallways that stretched forever, lockers rusted shut, floors warped with age, bells rang without pattern, and somewhere always just ahead of me, 3 sets of footsteps kept time. Morning arrived cold, the kind of Appalachian chill that seeps through layers and settles into bone. I woke with my jaw clenched so tight it ached. Outside, the campground looked normal again. Too normal. Sunlight filtering through leaves, dew on the grass, no footprints around the van, no sign of visitors. I packed up faster than usual, hands moving on autopilot. The plan was simple: leave. No second night, no curiosity-driven detours. I'd drive east, put miles between myself and Paintsville, chalk the whole thing up to a bad stretch of road and an overactive imagination fed by isolation. As I pulled onto the road, I caught movement in the side mirror. 3 figures standing at the edge of the trees. They didn't wave this time. They watched. I didn't slow down. The road out of town wound through low hills, the kind that hide what's coming until you're already committed. After 10 minutes, my phone buzzed. No signal, but a notification had pushed through anyway. A missed call. No number, just a blank space where a name should be. Then the radio crackled to life. I hadn't turned it on. Static hissed, rose, then fell into a child's voice humming. Not a song I recognized. Something repetitive, looping back on itself. The melody had the same unsettling quality as their laughter, like an imitation learned by rote. My hands tightened on the wheel. "Nope," I muttered, reaching to shut it off. The knob did nothing. The humming stopped. Silence stretched for a beat too long, then the voice spoke, clearer than before. "You weren't supposed to leave." I slammed the brakes, heart punching hard enough to steal my breath. The van lurched, engine sputtering before dying entirely. The road ahead shimmered with heat. Behind me, nothing but empty asphalt. I tried the ignition. Nothing. The smell hit me again. That old paper, mildew, sweetness, stronger now. Inside the van, I swallowed hard and forced myself to breathe through my mouth. Fear was no longer theoretical. It had weight, texture. It pressed against my thoughts, narrowing them, hurting them toward panic. "Okay," I said out loud to myself as much as anything else. "Okay. Think." I grabbed my keys, my flashlight, and stepped out. The woods felt closer than they had any right to be, crowding the road, leaning in. Cicadas buzzed in uneven bursts, like static with a pulse. I popped the hood, more out of habit than hope, and immediately knew I was out of my depth. Nothing obvious was wrong, no loose wires, no smoke. A shadow fell across the engine block. I straightened slowly. They stood on the opposite side of the road now, the 3 of them in a neat line. Close enough that I could see details I wished I couldn't. The way their clothes looked freshly pressed but decades out of style. The way their skin held no warmth, no variation. Like photographs cut loose from their pages. The girl tilted her head. "Why do you keep pretending?" she asked. My mouth felt dry enough to crack. "Pretending what?" "That you don't remember," one of the boys said. His voice was deeper than it should have been, threaded with something old. "Everyone does, at first." "I don't know you," I said. The words sounded thin, even to me. They exchanged a look, shared understanding, practiced. The other boy stepped forward, shoes making no sound on the pavement. "You were here before," he said. Something twisted in my chest. A memory surfaced, unwanted and sharp. A road trip with my parents when I was 9. A breakdown in eastern Kentucky. Waiting by the roadside while my father tried to flag down help. 3 kids watching from the trees. I'd forgotten their faces, or thought I had. "You stayed," the girl said softly. "Longer than most." The road seemed to tilt. I grabbed the edge of the van to steady myself. "That's not possible." "You left," she corrected, "but you were supposed to come back." The dread shifted then, deepening into something colder. This wasn't about me being in the wrong place. It was about me being late. "What do you want?" I asked. "To finish the picture," she said. The radio crackled behind me, pages flipping, the sound unmistakable now, paper turning, page after page, the historical society, the yearbooks, faces frozen in time. I understood suddenly what those books really were. Not records, placeholders. "No," I said, backing away, "I'm not a kid." They smiled then, all 3, not wide, not cruel, certain. "Neither are we," the first boy said. The air grew colder, breath fogging despite the sun. The woods exhaled, leaves shuddering as if stirred by a passing crowd. Panic surged, sharp and undeniable, overriding thought. I ran for the driver's seat, slammed the door, twisted the key again and again. The engine coughed. Once, then roared to life. I didn't look at them as I peeled away, tires screaming protest. The radio fell silent, the smell faded, the woods loosened their grip. I didn't stop until I crossed into West Virginia. I spent that night in a crowded rest stop, parked under harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by semis and noise and life. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw pages turning, faces waiting to be filled. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was over, that the road had claimed its toll and moved on. But sometimes when I pass a school, I catch a glimpse of children who look too familiar, too unchanged, and I understand now why locals don't walk after dark, why they insist on printing errors, why some places feel unfinished, some towns don't grow older, they just keep their children. I thought distance would dilute it, that miles, noise, other people would thin the memory until it became another strange road story I told myself not to dwell on. That's always been the lie of escape. You believe leaving a place means the place leaves you. It doesn't. 3 weeks later, I was camped outside Marietta, Ohio, parked beneath sycamores along the river, when the smell came back. Old paper, damp glue, that sweetness that never belonged outdoors. It slid into the van at dusk, riding the cooling air like a reminder slipped under a door. My hands stilled where they were, one on the kettle, the other braced against the counter. The campground was full this time. Families, laughter, a radio playing somewhere down the row. The presence of other people should have grounded me. Instead, it made the fear sharper, because whatever this was, it didn't need isolation anymore. I stepped outside. The river reflected the sky in long strips of bruised purple and gray. Children rode bikes along the gravel loop, their voices high and careless. I watched them too closely, my chest tight, cataloging faces for signs of sameness. Then one boy slowed as he passed me. He looked about 10, dark hair, pale eyes, too pale. He smiled, not fully, just enough to suggest the shape of it, and pedaled on. That night, I dreamed of paper again, of hands pressing me flat, smoothing me into place, of a camera flash that burned without heat. I woke with my heart hammering and the certainty that I'd reached the end of running roads. You can't outrun a thing that lives in memory. The next morning I drove back to Kentucky, not because I wanted to, but because the alternative was waiting, and waiting felt worse. Paintsville hadn't changed. Same leaning houses, same watchful porches, same air that felt just a degree too still. I parked near the Historical Society, hands shaking as I cut the engine. This time, no one seemed surprised to see me. The woman from before stood behind the desk, her expression unreadable. "You came back," she said. "I need to see them," I replied. She nodded once and led me into the back room without a word. The yearbooks were laid out on the table already. Open. New pages had been added. Photographs I recognized. My stomach dropped. There I was, 9 years old, standing awkwardly in a line of children I didn't know I remembered. There I was again at 10, 11, always the same expression, always looking just past the camera like I was watching someone leave. "You didn't finish," the woman said quietly. "Most don't." "Finish what?" My voice sounded far away. "Staying," she said. "Growing." The truth pressed in then, heavy and undeniable. Those children weren't trapped in town by accident. They were held in suspension by choice, by fear, by memory, by the part of a person that never quite moves on from the moment they were first afraid. I'd left that day as a child, but I'd never really gone. I carried Paintsville with me, folded between years like a pressed leaf. "They need you," she said. I closed my eyes, saw the road, the van, the open promise of motion. "What happens if I don't?" Her voice softened. "You've seen that." I walked back to the campground at dusk, the same one by the river. The woods greeted me like an old acquaintance. Cicadas rose in uneven chorus. I stood at the edge of the trees and waited. They didn't make me wait long. The 3 children stepped into the clearing just as the light failed. They looked the same as ever, but now I noticed the strain beneath it, the effort it took to remain unchanged. "You came back," the girl said. "I did," I replied. My fear was still there, coiled and watchful, but beneath it was something steadier. Resolve, maybe, or exhaustion. "It's time," the boy said. I nodded. The woods shifted, not physically, but perceptually, like a lens refocusing. The air grew thick with that paper smell, pages fluttering unseen. Images surfaced around us, layered over the present. Classrooms, playgrounds, roadside ditches, moments where fear had stalled growth and fixed it in place. I felt myself thinning, memories loosening their grip. "This is how it ends?" I asked. The girl shook her head. "It's how it moves." The sensation wasn't pain. It was release. Like finally setting down a weight you'd been carrying so long you forgot it wasn't part of you. The woods exhaled. The pressure eased. When it was over, the clearing was empty. No children, no smell, just trees and dusk and the sound of my own breathing. I left Paintsville before dawn. Months passed, then years. I still live on the road, still sleep in my old Volkswagen, though I avoid eastern Kentucky now, not out of fear, but respect. Some places deserve distance. Some lessons don't need revisiting. Sometimes, though, when I pass a school and hear laughter, I feel a quiet gratitude settle in my chest, not for the fear, but for the knowing. The road teaches you this. If you listen long enough, growing up isn't about leaving places behind. It's about carrying them forward without letting them stop you. And some towns will try, but you don't have to stay. You just have to remember how to keep moving. The first knock didn't sound like it came from outside. It sounded like it already knew my name. I remember the exact second my eyes opened because the red digits on the dash clock glowed 1:26 a.m., and for a moment I thought the sound had come from inside my own chest, like a heartbeat out of rhythm. I was parked just outside Logan, West Virginia, my old Volkswagen camper van, idling down into silence after a long mountain drive, frost still clinging to the windows like breath held too long. I'd told myself I was too tired to push farther, too wired to sleep, and just stubborn enough to believe I didn't need anyone else around me. My name's Caleb Mercer, 42 years old at the time, born and raised in Ohio coal country, the kind of place where silence can feel heavier than noise. I'd been RV camping for nearly 15 years, long enough to trust my instincts and long enough to know how easily I ignored them when they contradicted my plans. The Volkswagen was my pride, old, boxy, temperamental, but loyal. I called her Elsa because she rattled when she was cold and hummed when she finally warmed up. That night, the cold never really let go. I was supposed to camp at a small pull-off near the Guyandotte River, but the road signage was half buried under snow, and the GPS kept looping me back through town like it wanted me to reconsider. When I finally stopped, it wasn't because I'd found the campground. It was because I'd found a building that looked like it had been waiting. The boarding house sat back from the road, 3 stories tall, all narrow windows and peeling white paint, the kind of place that once meant something to a town before time leaned too hard on it. A hand-painted sign swung gently in the wind. Rooms, heat included. I remember laughing at that. Heat included felt like a promise and a threat all at once. The knock came again, sharper this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from the van door, it came from the wall behind my head. I froze, my breath fogging the air inside the camper, listening to the sound fade into the wood like it had never happened. My first instinct was mechanical. Branch tapping the siding, temperature shift, the van settling. I told myself that because it was easier than imagining anything else. Rationalization has a way of soothing you right up until it doesn't. I stepped outside, boots crunching on frozen gravel, and the silence pressed in so hard it felt intentional. No wind, no traffic, just the boarding house across the way, dark except for a single light glowing on the second floor. I stared at that window longer than I meant to, waiting for a shape, a movement, anything to justify the unease crawling up my spine. Nothing moved. That should have been my cue to leave. Instead, I locked the van and walked toward the house. Inside, the air smelled wrong. Old heat, damp wood, something faintly metallic underneath, like pennies soaked in water. The floors creaked in a way that suggested memory more than age, and the woman at the desk barely looked up when I signed the ledger. Her name tag said MRS Keller, though her eyes didn't match the friendliness of the smile she practiced. "You'll hear things at night," she said casually, sliding the key across the counter. "House settles?" I almost asked her what she meant by things, but something in her tone told me she'd already decided what my answer would be. Room 214 was small, narrow, with wallpaper that curled away from the corners like it was trying to escape. The heater clanged and hissed, coughing warm air into the room in uneven bursts. I set my bag down, pressed my palm against the wall out of habit, and felt a faint vibration, like distant machinery or a pulse. I slept in pieces. Sometime after midnight, the knocking started again. It was rhythmic, not loud, not frantic. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 3 more. Over and over, patient as a metronome. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each set, telling myself it had to be pipes, or wood contracting, or someone down the hall with insomnia and bad manners. But pipes don't wait for you to notice them. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the wall, just inches from my ear. I sat up, heart hammering so hard I worried it would drown out the sound, and pressed my ear closer. The knocking stopped immediately, as if whatever was making it had been listening too. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, thick, expectant, like a held breath. Then came the scratching. Soft at first, barely more than a whisper, like fingernails dragged lightly across wood. My stomach turned cold. I backed away from the wall, every instinct screaming to get out, but another part of me, the stubborn, curious part that had kept me RV camping through storms and breakdowns and bad decisions, wanted proof, wanted certainty. I turned on the lamp. The light revealed nothing unusual, just old wallpaper and a hairline crack running vertically near the corner. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself fear feeds on imagination, and imagination thrives in unfamiliar places. I told myself all the things you tell yourself when leaving feels like admitting weakness. The knocking resumed at 1:26 a.m. exactly. This time it was closer. Not louder, closer. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the edge of the bed until dawn, listening to the house breathe, to the heater's uneven rhythm, to the occasional footstep in the hallway that never quite passed my door. When morning finally came, gray and reluctant, I packed up fast and checked out without looking Mrs. Keller in the eye. Back in the Volkswagen, the engine protested the cold, and I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, letting the familiar smell of oil and old upholstery ground me. I told myself it was over, that whatever I'd experienced belonged to that place, not to me. The drive out of Logan was quiet, the mountains closing in like they always do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something unfinished behind me. The knocking had followed a pattern, and patterns mean intention. Intention means awareness. I pulled over once just to check the van to reassure myself that nothing had followed me. As I stepped out, my boots sank into a patch of thawed mud, and the smell hit me. Damp earth, old wood, and that same metallic tang from the boarding house. I traced it back to the side panel of the van, where the metal met the insulation. There, faint but unmistakable, were marks pressed into the inside lining. Handprints, facing outward. I didn't stop driving after that. I didn't camp that night. I didn't turn the radio on. I just kept my eyes on the road and my hands tight on the wheel, trying not to think about timing, about rhythm, about how some sounds don't belong to one place. Some sounds are looking for somewhere else to go. I crossed the state line before the sun fully cleared the ridgeline, the sky still bruised purple and gray, and I told myself the road was a clean boundary, that whatever I'd left behind in Logan had rules, had limits, had a geography it couldn't cross. I repeated that thought the way you repeat a prayer you don't fully believe in but need anyway. The Volkswagen hummed beneath me, steady and familiar, but every vibration felt amplified, as if my nerves had been stripped of insulation. I kept glancing at the side mirrors, half expecting to see movement where there should have been none, or worse, nothing where there should have been something. The handprints replayed in my mind over and over, not as an image, but as a sensation, the pressure of palms, the intent behind them. I stopped at a rest area just outside Charleston, needing coffee, needing daylight, needing proof that the world still behaved the way it was supposed to. The lot was nearly empty, just a semi idling near the far edge and a couple of sedans dusted with road salt. As I stepped out of the van, the cold bit through my jacket, sharp and clean, and for a moment I felt ridiculous for how tightly wound I was. Inside the restroom, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of disinfectant was almost comforting in its honesty. I splashed water on my face, stared at my reflection, and tried to recognize myself again. 42 years old, lines at the corners of my eyes, beard shot through with gray I pretended was just winter light. I'd been scared before, storms, sketchy campgrounds, strangers who lingered too long, but this felt different. This felt personal, like something had reached out and found a weak seam. When I returned to the van, the driver's side door was slightly ajar. I stood there longer than I should have, keys cold in my hand, listening. No footsteps, no voices, just the low hum of the semi's engine and the distant rush of traffic on the highway. I checked the locks, still engaged. I checked the ground, no fresh tracks but my own. I told myself the latch must not have caught, that old vehicles have quirks, that fatigue makes you see patterns where there are none. Inside, everything looked the same. Bag on the seat, thermos in the cup holder, nothing missing, except the clock. The little digital clock mounted above the dash was dark, unplugged from its socket and resting in the passenger footwell. I knew I hadn't moved it. I never unplugged it. It was one of those small habits you don't think about until it's violated. I plugged it back in. 1:26 a.m. The display flickered, then corrected itself to the current time, but my pulse didn't follow. It stayed elevated. A constant reminder that something had learned how to get close without being seen. I drove until afternoon before I felt steady enough to consider stopping again, pulling into a small, family-run campground tucked into a stand of bare winter trees. The owner, a man named Roy, waved from his porch and warned me the ground was hard and the nights were colder than they looked. I thanked him, paid cash, and parked near the edge of the lot where the woods pressed close. As dusk settled in, the temperature dropped fast. The smell of pine and cold soil crept into the van, and I welcomed it, needing something real and grounded to replace the phantom sense that kept surfacing in my memory. I cooked a simple meal, listened to the radio low, and forced myself into the routines that had always kept me safe. Check the locks. Check the surroundings. Trust what you can verify. The first sound came just after midnight. Not knocking this time. Breathing. It was so faint at first I thought it was my own, amplified by the enclosed space, but then it shifted, slower, deeper, slightly out of sync with my chest. I held my breath. The sound continued. I leaned closer to the wall, the same side panel where I'd seen the handprints earlier, and felt a vibration that wasn't mechanical, wasn't wind. The smell came next, that same metallic tang, stronger now, layered over damp wood and something sour, like old fabric left too long in water. My skin prickled, every hair standing on end, and denial surged up hard and fast. I told myself it had to be an animal, raccoon, possum, something curious and persistent. I told myself that because the alternative required a level of acceptance I wasn't ready for. Then came the tapping. 3 slow taps, a pause, 3 more. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I sat there, frozen, listening as the sound traveled, not across the surface of the van, but within it, migrating through the walls like it was learning the layout. The taps grew closer to the head of the bed, closer to where I lay, until I could feel them more than hear them, a subtle pressure against the metal. "Go away," I whispered, and the words felt absurd the second they left my mouth. The tapping stopped. The silence stretched, thin and taut, and for a brief, terrifying moment I thought I'd imagined everything. Then the wall bulged inward, just slightly, as if pressed from the other side. I scrambled back, heart pounding, and the bulge receded, leaving behind faint impressions in the insulation, shapes that resolved themselves into fingers, then palms, facing inward. Panic is a strange thing. It narrows your world to a single urgent directive: move. I grabbed my keys, fumbled them twice, and slammed them into the ignition. The engine protested, coughed, then roared to life. And as the headlights cut through the trees, I saw movement at the edge of the campsite. Not a figure, not exactly, but a distortion, like heat shimmer in winter air. I didn't wait to understand it. I threw the van into gear and tore out of the campground, gravel spraying, Roy's porch light shrinking in the mirror. The road twisted and dipped, and I drove it blind, tears blurring my vision, every nerve screaming that I was being followed. The tapping didn't stop. It kept time with the road, with my heartbeat, with the seconds ticking forward, whether I wanted them to or not. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Always from somewhere just out of reach, just beyond sight. I drove until dawn again, until exhaustion dulled the edges of fear into something heavier and more dangerous. When I finally pulled over, the van shuddered into silence, and I sat there hands shaking, staring at the wall. The impressions were gone. No handprints. No bulges, just smooth metal and insulation, innocent and unchanged. That was almost worse, because it meant whatever had been there didn't need to leave a mark to prove it existed. I sold the Volkswagen 3 months later. Told myself I needed something newer, something quieter, something less prone to quirks. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I couldn't sleep in enclosed spaces anymore. I couldn't stand the idea of walls that close, that intimate. I still camp. I still love the road. But I choose open ground now, places where sound has somewhere to go and silence doesn't feel like it's listening back. Sometimes late at night, when the wind hits just right, I hear a familiar rhythm carried on the air. 3 soft taps, a pause, then 3 more, and I remind myself to trust the lessons fear taught me. Not every door should be opened. Not every sound needs an answer. And when something knocks from inside the walls, the bravest thing you can do is leave before it learns how to follow you home. I thought distance would dull it, the way time dulls most things if you give it enough miles and enough excuses. But distance only taught it patience. Weeks passed after I sold the Volkswagen, weeks where I slept in borrowed rooms and cheap motels, anywhere that felt temporary enough to leave without explanation. I told people I was downsizing, simplifying, moving on. The truth was I couldn't stand to be enclosed by anything that felt permanent. Walls felt like promises I didn't trust anymore. I bought a newer rig eventually, a wider, brighter RV with thinner walls and bigger windows. I chose it for visibility, for airflow, for the illusion of control. I told myself the past was mechanical, situational, tied to that old boarding house in Logan and the memories I disturbed by staying too close. I told myself fear has inertia, that it keeps moving long after the threat is gone. The first night I slept in the new RV, I parked in an open desert campground in Arizona, the sky wide and sharp with stars, no trees pressing in, no buildings nearby, just wind and distance and space. I lay there listening to the hum of the heater, letting my body relearn what rest felt like. Sometime after midnight, the heater shut off. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was alert. I lay still, counting my breaths, listening for the telltale sounds of mechanical cooling, for the tick and pop of metal tracting. They didn't come. Instead, there was a subtle shift in pressure, like the air inside the RV had been displaced. Then came the knock. 1, 2, 3. Not against the exterior, not on the door, but from the panel above my head where the ceiling met the wall. The sound wasn't loud, but it was precise, intentional, the kind of knock you make when you know exactly where someone is sleeping. My throat tightened and a familiar denial surged up, fierce and desperate. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Different place, different walls, different everything. I sat up slowly, every muscle coiled, and the knocking stopped mid-pattern, as if whatever was making it had been waiting for that movement. The silence stretched, and in it I felt something else, a presence not defined by shape or sound, but by attention, the unmistakable sensation of being noticed. "Not here," I said, my voice hoarse. You don't belong here. The words felt inadequate the moment they left me, like trying to reason with gravity. The temperature dropped suddenly, breath turning visible in the beam of the small reading light. The smell followed, metallic, damp, threaded with that same sour note I remembered from Logan. My stomach rolled, and I swung my legs out of bed, needing distance from the walls, from the ceiling, from anything that could hide what I couldn't see. The knocking resumed, faster now. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. But the pause shortened, the rhythm tightening like a pulse accelerating. I backed toward the door, every step deliberate, and as I did, the sound traveled, sliding along the wall to keep pace with me. Never ahead, never behind. Always exactly where I was. Panic flared hot and sharp, but beneath it was something colder, understanding. This wasn't tied to a place, it was tied to a moment, to a weakness I'd exposed when I ignored my instincts back in Logan, when I stayed, when I listened instead of leaving. The RV shuddered, not from wind, but from pressure, the walls flexing inward in subtle waves. I reached the door, fingers fumbling with the latch, and felt resistance, not physical, but psychological, a sudden certainty that opening it would invite something in rather than let me out. The knocking stopped. In the silence, I heard something new. Scratching. Not random. Not exploratory. Deliberate lines drawn through the material, slow and methodical, like someone testing the thickness of a barrier. The sound came from everywhere at once, walls, ceiling, floor, surrounding me in a web of intent. "This ends now," I said, louder this time, and the words surprised me with their steadiness. I closed my eyes, forced my breathing to slow, and did the one thing I hadn't done before. I stopped rationalizing. I stopped denying. I acknowledged it, not with curiosity, not with fear, but with clarity. "You don't get to follow me," I said. "You don't get to live where I live." The scratching intensified, the sound sharpening, and the RV creaked under the strain. I felt a pressure in my ears, a rising whine that made my vision blur, and for a moment I thought the walls would give way entirely. Then it stopped, not gradually, not reluctantly, instantly. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It wasn't expectant, it wasn't listening. It was empty in a way that felt earned, like the aftermath of a storm that had spent itself. I opened my eyes. The air warmed, the smell dissipated, the reading lights steadied. I stood there for a long time, waiting for the next sound, the next test, but none came. When I finally opened the door, the desert night greeted me, cool, expansive, indifferent. The stars burned on, unchanged. I didn't sleep after that. I watched the horizon until dawn, letting the light reclaim the space inch by inch. When the sun finally rose, I packed up and left, not in a rush, but with intention. I didn't feel chased. I felt finished. I don't know what was knocking from inside the walls. I don't pretend to have an answer that fits neatly into reason or myth. What I know is this: some things attach themselves not to places, but to choices, to moments when you ignore the quiet warning in your chest, because curiosity feels safer than fear. RV camping taught me freedom, resilience, self-reliance, but it also taught me humility. The land doesn't care about your plans. Old structures don't forget who passes through them. And when the environment turns its attention toward you, the lesson isn't always about survival. Sometimes it's about listening. I still camp under open skies. I still chase roads that disappear into the horizon. But I don't stay where my instincts tell me not to. I don't argue with unease. And when the night goes too quiet, when a sound feels too close to be coincidence, I leave. Because courage isn't standing your ground when something knocks from inside the walls. Courage is knowing when to walk away and never looking back. I didn't talk about it for a long time. Not because I didn't want to, but because every time I tried, language failed me. Words turn things into stories, and stories imply distance, something finished, something contained. What happened to me never felt contained. It felt folded into my habits, my decisions, the quiet ways I move through the world now. Months after the desert, I took a contract driving supplies between small towns in the Midwest, long stretches of highway where the land flattens out and the sky feels heavy instead of wide. I stayed in the RV, but only in places where the wind could reach me from all sides. I learned to read silence the way other people read weather radar. Most nights were uneventful, blessedly normal. But every once in a while, usually around that same hour, just after 1 in the morning, I'd feel it again. Not knocking, not scratching. Attention. It would start as a pressure behind my eyes, a sense of being measured, like something was counting breaths instead of seconds. The walls never moved. The air never changed temperature. Nothing happened that could be pointed to, proven, dismissed. And that, I learned, was the point. Fear doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it waits to see if you've learned. The closest I came to breaking was in a small Illinois town whose name I don't remember, only the smell of thawing mud and diesel. I'd parked near a grain elevator, its metal silos looming pale in the moonlight. I told myself it was fine, open ground, no trees, no buildings with history pressed into their bones. At 1:26 a.m., my phone buzzed. No notification, no call, just a vibration, brief and deliberate, like a tap against my leg. I picked it up, heart already racing, and saw the screen light up with nothing but the lock display. The time glowed back at me. 1:26. I didn't wait for anything else to happen. I started the engine and drove. That's the part people don't like when I finally do tell them pieces of this story. They want confrontation. They want explanation. They want a moment where something shows itself clearly enough to be defeated or understood. But the lesson wasn't about winning. It was about boundaries. Whatever I encountered didn't need to manifest fully to have power. It only needed access to my doubt, my stubbornness, my willingness to stay when every instinct told me to go. Once I stopped offering that access, it lost its leverage. I began to change how I camped, not just where. I stopped pushing through exhaustion. I stopped telling myself I was overreacting. If a place felt wrong, even for reasons I couldn't articulate, I left. No second chances, no bargaining. And slowly, so slowly I almost missed it, the nights grew quieter. Not empty, not dead. Healthy. The kind of quiet where sounds belong to the world instead of to you. Wind in grass, distant traffic, an owl calling to something unseen but natural. My body learned the difference again, muscle memory returning where fear had once lived. I still think about that boarding house in Logan sometimes, about the contractors tearing open walls and finding handprints pressed into the wood, facing outward, as if someone or something had been trying to leave long before I ever arrived. I wonder how many people heard the knocking and stayed. How many convinced themselves it was just the house settling? How many didn't make it out with only memories? What haunts me isn't that something followed me. It's the realization that it didn't have to. It only needed me to doubt myself once. RV camping teaches you to respect weather, terrain, machinery, but there's another lesson they don't put in guidebooks. One you learn only when the night leans too close and the walls feel thinner than they should. Your instincts are older than your plans. Your fear is not your enemy. And some warnings don't come from outside at all. They come from the quiet knock inside your own chest, telling you when it's time to move. I listen now. Every time.